road long before any TEP utilities along the route. This is a photo. You may not be able to see it very good. On near Roger Wash, looking north on Silver Bell Road. On the west side only are very large, tall TEP power poles. There are 38 poles with 11 strands of wires on the west side from Goray Road to El Camino del Cerro. The photo shows no power poles on the east side of Silver Bell Road, so the variance request for new poles and service lines along both sides of Silver Bell Road is not warranted. There is no natural scenic quality to the existing TEP power poles with many wire lines. The Silver Bell Road widening is an opportunity for TEP to improve the designated scenic route and meet the purpose in Tucson UDC Section 5.3 Scenic Corridor Zone, and to comply with Section 5.3.9A, quote, utilities on public right-of-way along scenic routes shall be underground. This is a partial quote. You have the full quote. There are some historic and archaeological significant sites along Silver Bell Road, but not along the entire three-mile scenic route. Archaeology findings have not stopped development, just resulted in more responsible and respectful development with mitigation where required. It appears the existing TEP poles along only the west side of Silver Bell Road have many wires for electricity to serve more people than in the Tucson mountains. TEP should not use Silver Bell Road as an electricity transmission corridor. East of Silver Bell Road, about 1/10 to 1/4 of a mile, is the TEP future site of a large transmission line within an existing utility corridor. Any TEP power poles proposed along Silver Bell Road should be within that utility corridor. Silver Bell Road has been a scenic road for over a century. TEP knew that when they placed large power poles on the west side only. The Design Review Board should not grant a special privilege to TEP for a utility challenge they created. The Tucson Mountains Association did not hear about this TEP variance request until very recently. I have not seen any TEP plans, but I heard about plans showing above ground TEP poles on both sides of Silver Bell Road. No east side poles. Please recommend denial to the Board of Adjustment of the variance request along the entire 3-mile Silver Bell Road designated scenic route. TEP should immediately start plans for underground utilities in most locations and perhaps a variance at some sites. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning.
All right, thank you very much. Is there any other audience members that want to introduce themselves? If not,
yes, I do. Can you hear me? My name is Denise Baldwin, and you received our letter. I'm the Vice President of Tucson Mountains Association, and also a resident of the West Side.
For our meeting, could you state your address, please?
Absolutely. My address is 1101 North Calle Gardenias, Tucson, Arizona, 85745.
Great, thank you.
Is that...
Yeah, we just need to log that in there.
That's fine, that's fine. We oppose granting TEP a variance on Silver Bell Scenic Route. We should refer to the primary legislation from the Line Siting Committee and the Tucson Ordinance. What we know first and foremost, that TEP is a Canadian company that has made nearly $100 million in the first half of 2021. They've continued to industrialize the Tucson scenic beauty with monstrous metal towers. And these wires have helped to award Tucson the ugliest street in the country. And how have they done this? By convincing all of us that they can do no better, but they can. We have the legislation in place, we have scenic routes, we have ordinances, and we can protect our scenic routes. The CEC conditions order the orders appeared to be objects for TEP to circumvent. They went into this knowing this, and we have the conditions themselves that have given them guidance. They state specifically the conditions that this certificate is granted upon the following conditions: that the applicant shall comply with all existing applicable statutes, ordinances, master plans, and regulations of any governmental entity having jurisdiction during the construction of the CEC route. Further cultural resource orders are given in points 7 through 8. But nowhere does it say that the appearance of cultural resources prevent or stop the compliance of the law. The state says it is up to TEP to follow the law. And so TEP should not be granted this variance for the condition for which it itself created. It selected Silver Bell route, knowing that it was a scenic route. And we need to hold them responsible. TEP utilized a 2010 study that referred to cultural artifacts in the area. The CEC on page 11, line 20 of the 2021 report, and the city of Tucson has archaeological recovery procedures. Now that TEP has selected the location, TEP must follow the recovery process and be in compliance with the scenic route ordinance. TEP, the city of Tucson ordinance for undergrounding and scenic routes crafted with intent, with purpose to protect our scenic routes, protect our scenic beauty. The road and other utility construction can comply. Why can't TEP? Granting this variance dilutes the ordinance's intent and the ordinance itself. So we cannot let TEP undermine that or continue to undermine that. The Design Review Board must recommend that the ordinance and procedure for any special circumstance that may arise while enforcing this ordinance. I thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you very much. We've never had any audience members before, and so I appreciate the two of you. Before I ask if there's another one, I think we should just say that we probably should set a time limit, maybe 2 or 3 minutes of talking, because we do have business to take care of. Is there anyone else in the audience that would like to speak for 2 or 3 minutes? All right, thank you. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to, actually before case number 4 is presented to us by staff, or maybe as it's presented, Maria, I had asked for some background information on the scenic route, kind of the origin of it, so that the Design Review Board could understand exactly what it was. And if you could go over that information, or if you want me to present it, you know, the information that you researched, we could do that too. But I'd like to provide that as background.
Mr. Chair, members of the
yes,
board,
Mr.
good
Kaplan,
morning.
members of the.
Good morning.
Sorry,
I'm Ruslyn Wells, the City of Tucson Zoning Administrator, and Maria asked me to do some of the research in the background. So part of my staff presentation this morning will include that background information.
Okay. In that case, please proceed with the presentation.
Yes, so I would like to first, since we have members present that weren't here at the last meeting, I'm going to represent the case and go over the findings briefly, and then we will get to the questions that Mr. Kapler asked. This morning before you is Board of Adjustment case C10-2108, Tucson Electric Power Pole Relocation and Modification. The applicant is proposing to relocate and modify existing power poles and add new poles and service lines above ground in the right-of-way along both sides of Silver Bell Road. The project area is along Silver Bell Road, starting approximately at the intersection of Glory Road and continuing north approximately to the intersection of El Camino del Cerro. The Silver Bell Road is considered a designated scenic route within this proposed area of work. The applicants are requesting the following variances. The first is to allow relocation and modification of power poles above ground in a scenic route. And the second variance under consideration is to allow new power poles and service lines to be installed above ground on a scenic route. What is triggering this is a road widening project by Department of Transportation and Mobility. And so that road widening project necessitates the poles being relocated out of the roadway. We're going from a 2-lane road to a 4-lane road with a center turn lane. The Board of Adjustment can hear and decide variance requests from regulations in the UDC, and they may grant a variance under the following circumstances. The first circumstance is that there are special circumstances applicable to the property where strict enforcement of the UDC will deprive that property of privileges enjoyed by other properties of the same classification in the same zoning district. The next item is that the special circumstances were not self-imposed or created by the owner or one in possession of the property.
Russell, and pause right there. Marie, could you put that on the screen where she's reading the criteria? That would be helpful.
Yes, I think it would be. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
The third criteria is the variance granted is subject to such conditions as will assure that the adjustment authorized shall not constitute a grant of special privileges inconsistent with the limitations upon other properties in the vicinity and zone in which such property is located. The fourth criteria is that because of special circumstances applicable to the property, including its size, shape, topography, location, surroundings, the property cannot reasonably be developed in conformity with the provision of the UDC. Criteria 5 is that the granting of the variance will not be detrimental to the public welfare or injurious to other property or improvements in the neighborhood in which the property is located. Finding 6, that the proposed variance will not impair an adequate supply of light and air to adjacent property, substantially increase congestion, or substantially diminish or impair property values within the neighborhood. And the final finding that the Board of Adjustment must find in compliance is that the variance, if granted, is the minimum variance that will afford relief and is the least modification possible of the UDC provisions that are in question. So that's the criteria that the board must use when rendering its decision. It cannot consider other factors. Mr. Chair, you asked several questions. You asked who established the scenic corridor, how was it established, were cultural resources known at the time? So I want to start with the first part, who established it? In 1981, Pima Association of Governments, which is the regional planning entity, was developing its 1981 long-range transportation plan. And PAG's regional council stated that to the maximum extent possible, new roadways should be constructed as scenic routes. Following that lead, the City of Tucson's mayor and council recognized the need to take measures to preserve views of prominent mountain ridges and scenic view sheds along new roadways. And they directed staff to develop recommendations for the establishments of scenic routes. The city's planning department, and in conjunction with the transportation department, developed the major streets and routes plan. The plan was adopted in 1982 and includes roadway standards, guidance for landscaping, the roadways, etc. And in 1985, the City of Tucson mayor and council adopted zoning regulations, which actually established the scenic corridor zone and the gateway route overlays. Both processes involve public outreach and public hearings prior to mayor and council taking action. You asked about cultural resources. The TEP poles along the stretch of Silverdale predate the adoption of the PAG long-range transportation plan, the city's major streets and routes plan, and the city zoning regulations pertaining to scenic corridor and gateway routes. The MFNR standards and associated zoning regulations necessitating undergrounding apply to all scenic and gateway routes. And this stretch of corridor the Silverbell corridor is rather unique in that it lies within an ancient Hohokam Indian settlement. And looking at the timeline, et cetera, I don't think that when they adopted the MSNR plan and the zoning codes regulations, that they specifically anticipated the impact of undergrounding along this specific stretch of road. Because the road, the regulations cannot anticipate every circumstance. So with that in mind, when regulations are created, it's important to note that in this instance, Mayor and Council did not include regulations that prohibit granting of variances to scenic corridor zone regulations when that is appropriate and warranted. In some instances in the code, you do have regulations where it specifically prohibits granting of variances, but this is not one of them. So there is that ability to grant a variance, but again, meeting those standards we just talked about with that in mind. So I did include, yes, go ahead.
On just, so according to your research, when the scenic view concept was approved, were cultural resources at that time, were they sensitive to cultural resources or not knowledgeable about the cultural resources in the area?
Well, keep in mind, Nathan, that the scenic corridor zone overlay is citywide. They didn't specifically look along Silverbell and say along here there might be cultural resources, so you can't disturb it. They wrote generic regulations that are applicable to the
sort of a
city.
global. It was sort of a global zoning. Is it a zone? Is it a zoning regulation? Is that what it is?
Yes, it's an overlay zone, the scenic corridor zone and gateway corridor zones. And they're along major streets and routes. Scenic corridor zones are often along areas where there's some vistas and terrain, in slightly more rural areas when they were initially designated. And the gateways tended to be designated along those corridors that led to major employment centers, attractions, that sort of thing. So they were more urban in nature, but the regulations are almost identical for both gateway and scenic corridor.
Okay, continue. Thank you for that clarification.
Okay. So I did include in the information that Maria had, I just, talked about I'm going to talk briefly about the purpose. So from the Tucson Unified Development Code, Scenic Corridor Zone, Section 5.3.2 purpose. The purpose is to protect the city's unique visual setting and promote its economic well-being. Performance standards are required to assure design sensitivity to the natural scenic quality. These standards are established to provide for the preservation of A, views of prominent mountain ridge lines that form the limits of scenic view sheds and provide a natural backdrop for sensitively designed development. B, it's designed for the preservation of view sheds that provide the observer with a visual perspective of the area in terms of foreground, middle ground, and background. C, it is to preserve the scenic quality of the desert and mountain environment through the retention of native vegetation and natural topography. And D, it is to preserve view windows through an aesthetic scening or siting of developmental elements that are incompatible with the natural qualities of the surrounding area. And so with that in mind, per the Unified Development Code, variances may be granted when there are special circumstances that are not self-imposed, such as location, topography, lot shape, etc., that result in the inability to reasonably, and that word is key, reasonably develop in conformance with the regulations in question. So ultimately, the DRB is tasked with making a recommendation to the Board of Adjustment on the variance request based on the following. One, that the DRB first needs to determine whether there are special circumstances that are not imposed. And should they find that, then they need to then determine whether undergrounding in this location is or is not reasonable given the special circumstances they've identified. This concludes staff's presentation. I'm available for questions. If not, I will turn it over to Maria.
Are there questions, DRB, on the background of this application? We still will get a presentation from the applicant, but are there questions with sort of the groundwork that Ruslan has laid out there?
I guess I just had a question. It seems that a lot of this has been compounded by ADOT widening this road. I wondered why was that ever kind of questioned, why they're widening the road in the first place?
And I think it's TDOT that is widening it, not ADOT.
Right, I believe it's a
Mr.
result of a, go ahead, Maria, I'm sorry.
No, I was just gonna suggest, Mr. Kapler, members of the DRB, maybe that question can be answered during the portion of the presentation by the applicant.
I mean, is there anyone from that group here?
We have the project manager from the City of Tucson Department of Transportation and Mobility present, I believe.
Hi, Maria. Good
Okay.
morning. This is Kyle DeWitt. I'm with the City of Tucson DTM. I joined the city about 3 years ago and was assigned to as a project manager to this portion of the improvements that are actually this portion from Gore to Community del Cerro is one of 3 portions of Silver Bell. The first portion already being constructed between Grant and Gore. Like I said, this section is between Gore and Camino del Cerro, and the last section is between Camino del Cerro and Ina. And it's part of a longer overall plan for that involved the RTA, Marana, City of Tucson, Pima County, for a long-range plan for improvement of Silver Bell Road to handle traffic into the future.
We just got a message here from Mr. Rick Ellis from PAG. He's available also to answer questions.
Well, maybe we can handle those specific questions for the applicant during or after their presentation. Any more clarification that we want from Russell and Maria before we turn it over to the applicant for their discussion? All right.
Hey, this is Chris.
Okay, Chris. Good.
I'm not sure if this is the appropriate time during the presentation would be. I would have a question or have concern about the provision about ownership, and that I'd like somewhere through the presentation to have clarification of ownership of the right of way, whether TEP is a rightful owner or if they are blessed an easement, access easement to the property, so that there was that provision about that about ownership of the property within our purview. So that's something I'd like to have information on during the presentation. Ownership, what the ownership relationship is with DTM, City of Tucson, and TEP within that corridor.
Okay, we'll be looking for that answer.
I've got another request kind of following that hopefully during the presentation there can be some kind of clarification of where the bigger picture of I mean, obviously energy is important and some kind of north-south corridor, but with the new I-11 plan, you know, have you guys, which is fairly recent, have you guys kind of considered that, you know, that big picture of all the big changes that are going on with our infrastructure right now?
Great, we'd like to hear the big picture here. Shall we turn it over to the TEP applicant? Okay, let's do that.
So, Kevin, I'll stop sharing my screen so you can share yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I know. Good morning, and yeah, thank you for continuing discussion to be heard in this matter of TEP power poles on Silver Bell Road. During the previous meeting, I presented background and design information pertaining to the design alignment, visual simulations, materials, and other content. As a quick recap, TEP is being asked to relocate existing overhead power lines to make room for this voter-approved Silver Bell Road Transportation Improvement Project. Were it not for this transportation improvement project, TEP would not be proposing this work. Phase 2 of the transportation project is located from Gore Road to El Camino del Cerro. TEP has an existing overhead power line located along this entire segment. The existing line is located on the west side of Silver Bell Road. The current project design involves keeping the power line on the west side from Camino del Cerro to Sweetwater Road, and then transitioning the line to the east side of Silver Bell from Sweetwater to a point just north of Gore Road. So in that segment where the line is transitioned to the east side of the road, the existing line on the west side of the road will be removed. So at that location, there won't be a transmission line, sub-transmission line on either side of the road. So the current design is overhead, and as such, as we've been discussing, is subject to city UDC pertaining to the scenic arterial street. The line that TEP has predates the scenic ordinance, and it's also a 46 kV line, which is not subject to or certificated by the ACC. So there is no CEC pertaining to this line, nor does the line siting committee or the ACC have jurisdiction over that voltage of line class. If there were a CEC, this line would be exempted from the scenic ordinances. So the items that we identified for continued
quick question on
discussion.
that. If I could ask.
Yeah.
You mentioned the voltage. So by mentioning that, are you saying that the voltage is not high enough to be exempt? Or are you saying it's very high? What does that mean? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, that's so the ACC, the state and line siting committee oversees voltages of 115 kilovolts and above. This is 46, so it's below the voltage that's under the jurisdiction of the ACC. So
Gotcha.
therefore, no CEC is issued for a line of this voltage class.
So for my understanding, if it was 115 and above, we wouldn't be having this conversation because it would be exempt?
It would be exempt per the city ordinances.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Of course. So yeah, several of the items that we identified for continued discussion are the basis of today's agenda. These include archaeology, they include other utilities within the project area and how an underground electric infrastructure would interact with these utilities. Includes information about the Santa Cruz River floodplain and tributary wash floodplains, as well as landscaping. Now, the Transportation Improvement Project is a multi-party initiative, and while TEP is the applicant being heard today, we are not the project proponent per se. For example, Pima County is managing the archaeological component of this project under an intergovernmental agreement with the city. As such, Ian Milliken with Pima County will be presenting information about archaeology, and to the extent and significance of these archaeological resources, these pose special circumstances that limit the feasibility of constructing an underground electric line along Silver Bell Road. For reference, in relation to Ian's information, an electric utility underground trench standard specification would look something like this slide. So we're looking at the 46 voltage.
Kevin, I think we're on the wrong screen. So we're seeing your notes if you're trying to show something.
Let me switch over.
Sorry to interrupt, everyone.
No, this will be more pertinent here. So let's get this. So this is the screen that will show the underground trench. So the width of the trench is 10 feet wide, and the 46 voltage will be located in a 4-foot minimum area. And then there's a horizontal separation of 5 feet between the 46 voltage and the 13.8 voltage. So that separation is shown at the top would have a width of trench that would be 10 foot wide. So plus communications and the separation required for communications, that can add an additional 5 feet of width. So the total width of a trench could be up to 15 or more feet. In addition to the trench, there needs to be an underground vault every 800 feet for pulling conduit and operations. And there needs to be separate boxes for the 46 voltage and for the 13.8 voltage. So there would be these underground vaults every 800 feet that would need to be constructed along the length of Silver Bell on the east side. So that this provides some context in relation to what Ian will be presenting pertaining to the archaeological resources. So I'll transition it over to Ian. He'll present information about archaeology as it relates to this project, and then we'll reconvene on this slide deck and we can look at underground utilities and the other items. So with that, Ian, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen and you can go ahead and queue up your presentation.
All right, well, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity and being here this morning. My name is Ian Milliken. I am the Cultural Resources Manager for Pima County. I'm going to take you through kind of a pretty comprehensive overview of, I think there's some misconceptions about the density of archaeological resources, how archaeological resources tie into this project. But first and foremost, I just want to let the members of the committee know I am not here on behalf of TEP. My kind of testimony, if you will, today is really in relation to the resource. And it's the considerations that I think this committee needs when reviewing this variance outside of any ties to necessarily just TEP's actions, but we need to look at this from a project whole standpoint. And as Kevin mentioned, TEP's work is resulting from this larger transportation project for which the cultural resources background that I'm going to provide you, I think is going to give some context to better inform your decision. So I'm going to take you through kind of the framework. We talked about 3 segments of this project. The first was the grant to Goree. That was an entirely local undertaking, which means that it was the City of Tucson designed, City of Tucson construction. There was really no major other stakeholders outside of neighborhood communities. There was no federal involvement. There was no state involvement. Once we move past Goree, the Goree to Ina is a federal project, and I'll show you what that means when I say a federal project. Let me make sure I've got there we go. I'm going to take you through the previous work that informed on the archaeological resources. I think there are some questions about when we knew what we knew about this corridor in terms of the cultural resources sensitivity as it relates to the scenic corridor designation. The archaeology has been phased for this project into 3 stages. It is pre-construction work. It is utility relocation, which is what we're in right now. And then there's the construction stage. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of the results of what we uncovered in the past year as a result of the pre-construction phase that better informs of the sheer cultural density and the cultural landscape on which this project is situated. And then I'll be providing some last recommendations. So to start out, everyone's probably familiar with this 2010 survey. It was actually, there's a redacted version that was put on the Silver Bell website. I believe the board has had a chance to review that. In this survey, what this means is that archaeologists walked this entire corridor and documented an uninterrupted deposit of cultural resources. Now, in this survey, it was determined that we were crossing many of these ephemeral washes, these washes that basically transport water from the Tucson mountains down to the Santa Cruz River. These were optimal settings for ancestral settlements due to the importance of water in our area. So when Silver Bell Road, the grant to Comunidad del Cerro, was designated as a senior arterial street, there had been very little pedestrian survey. There had been very little known about this area. Contrastly, look on the east side of the Santa Cruz, major development corridor. Here we have tons and tons of a long history of surveys that have documented a wide variety of cultural resources and a prehistoric use of this area. So there was little to no underlying data that could have suggested the sheer magnitude of the cultural resources sensitivity at the area at the time the scenic designation was provided. So as a result of this survey, over 39 archaeological sites were identified. Now, what that means is that when archaeologists walk on the surface, they identify specific areas in which they're seeing artifacts. Those areas are bounded per the Arizona State Museum to create a boundary. It's a management boundary that's used for the Arizona State Museum site designation. But because of the way that these boundaries were kind of commingled on the landscape, it was really clear that a surface expression of an archaeological site is not necessarily indicative of what is actually going on below the surface. This resulted in the archaeologists basically determining that this is a district. It's a Silver Bell Archaeological District. This district was determined eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places by the State Historic Preservation Officer at the time of this report. So moving on to 2014, the first segment is constructed. This is again a local project, City of Tucson, design and construction. There was no federal nexus. There was no federal oversight. It was not a federal project. The survey findings in this section were actually negative on the surface. However, because of the population of resources that were found north of that area, there was some precautionary subsurface testing, which means the archaeologists are actually putting a backhoe into the ground in order to really see what's going on. And sure enough, 2 archaeological site contexts, very broad, were found in this area and required mitigation, which stalled the project. Not greatly, but it was a wrench in there because we couldn't actually do a preemptive strike on it, which means that we need to analyze the plans. We need to determine where the impacts are going to be and mitigate just those impacts. So at that point, it forced a review of the design. It forced a review of which areas are actually going to be impacted in these subsurface areas, and then those were targeted for mitigation. So testing confirmed an array of buried cultural resource deposits that did require mitigation. Okay, so what does a federal compliance project mean? When we talk about local ordinances, that's one thing. This project is subject to a Clean Water Act permit, a Section 404 permit. This federal permit is basically the umbrella under which every activity of this project must comply. So understand that this requires compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. It triggers tribal consultation. It triggers involvement of as many stakeholders as possible. And the lead of this effort is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They have jurisdiction over this project. They determine whether this project is viable, how it needs to be mitigated, all of these steps in conjunction with the project stakeholders. Now, just to give you an idea, we are dealing with 12 federally recognized Indian tribes. They are listed here. They are all active participants in this project, 3 of which are very active. That is our 2 local tribes, the Pascayaki, the Tohono O'odham, and the Hopi tribe have all played active roles in this, with the other tribes deferring to those 3 tribes. We also have 7 state and local agencies. These agencies, and including the Corps, which is federal, these agencies all are partnering with the tribes in creating the federal compliance background that governs not only cultural resources, but all environmental considerations for this project, and applies to all utility relocations, design, and construction. All components of this project are purview to these groups discussing and coming to an agreement on how procedures are mitigated. So in preparation for this, there was a programmatic agreement. This is a legal document that is formulated at the earliest stage of the project. This programmatic agreement was finalized in 2018. It basically outlined the process of saying what we are all committing to. And it basically based off of the stakeholder values that were presented at the time of this consultation. It developed a historic properties treatment plan, basically a guidance document for the archaeology saying this is how we're going to implement the process. These are the resources we are going to be looking at, and this is the actions we're going to take when necessary. So to that end, the conclusion and the consensus was there is going to be a hierarchical approach to this project. The first foremost goal of agreed upon all stakeholders was to avoid disturbance as much as possible. The second was to minimize our impact. The third and last and final option, only when necessary, was to mitigate. Now understand that this applies to all aspects of the project. This hierarchy applies to the design process, the construction process, archaeology, biology, wildlife connectivity, you name it. So in evaluating potential impacts, the team analyzed all the options to fulfill the necessary requirements of the project with the least impactful approach. Anytime an avoid minimize approach was an option, the team would work to select that option. Now, in contrast, think about I-10, okay? I-10, you have very little option for avoidance. This is a major undertaking involving a lot of ground disturbance, especially when you're raising roadways and lowering roadways and doing all these types of things. It's really difficult to get to that avoidance. And ADOT will actually take an approach that even in their surplus properties, they will go in and mitigate. The tribes have objected to this strategy for numerous years. And unfortunately, under a federal process, with the Army Corps being the lead and not federal highways, the Army Corps is listening to the tribes. Think Rosemont, everything that's going on with Rosemont. Think border wall, everything that's going on with border wall. The tribe's voice is more prevalent than ever today in our community, and the Corps is listening. So lessons learned, assuming any resources, making the assumption that any resource can be mitigated and that mitigation fulfills legal requirements, it contradicts the legacy of cultural resources management in Southern Arizona. The county and the city of Tucson have a long and deep history of being the local government model for the nation in conservation and historic preservation. So, how do we look at this project and how do we determine where these impacts are going to occur? So the very first step was looking at the potential for effects. Assuming an uninterrupted deposit of cultural resources, we scrutinized the plans. And what we did is we found that the majority of activity associated with this project is actually bringing in fill and raising the roadway as opposed to cutting in and ground disturbing activities. This map kind of shows you the extent of the disturbances. Once we get to that point, what happens is under the federal process, you determine something called the area of potential effects. This polygon that you are seeing right now, think of it as a cage. It is hard walled. No activity can occur outside of this. When the construction contractor moves in, guess what? They're actually setting up a perimeter fence indicating to all their personnel that they cannot step foot outside of this project with activities related to this project. This goes for all the utilities as well. All utility work must be confined to this area. Now, potential effects, that is the key here. It's area of potential effects. It's not area of effects, where we can basically blanket the area, bulldoze where necessary, mitigate as necessary. There needs to be that tiered option, that tiered approach to the compliance activities. So a real quick overview of the timeline, October 2020 to May 2021, that was the pre-construction phase of this project. That was investigating everything outside of the current road prism. Now by investigating, it doesn't mean mitigating everything. It just means getting the breadth and width of the cultural resources as best we can tell based off the extent of the proposed impacts. So the pink area is everything outside of that road prism. That was complete in May of 2021. Now we're transitioning into the utility relocation stage, where we analyze utility relocation plans. We monitor and mitigate all utility relocations requiring ground disturbance. However, all utilities are very much aware that the preferred option is aerial. And the reason being is that aerial options minimize, if not avoid, unnecessary impacts to cultural resources. Construction, monitor earthwork, ensure protection and in place preservation of avoided resources. We are actually going to be taking proactive measures in areas where fill activities are going to occur by laying down protective surfaces that the contractor will work on because of the shallow nature of cultural deposits in specific areas. Mitigate disturbances below existing road prism. Obviously, we know that there are going to be some cut activities underneath the current roadway that the archaeologists are not going to get access to until the contractor removes that asphalt. And so we will be mobilizing during that phase as well. So previous archaeological work, there was a question about really what do we know about this area and to inform on really what's going on subsurface. So this is the Animal Care Center. This is what it looks like today. Okay, in 2016, this is what it looked like. Now, it looks pretty well, you know, it's had development. It's had a bunch of different activities occur over the course of, we'll call it the past 100 years. So the first thing we do is we know it's a known archaeological site, this area. I'm not showing you the site boundary, but take my word for it that previous work has happened here, that we know that we're in an archaeological context. So what we're doing here is we're basically doing as much as we can in testing the areas around the development area to get an understanding of what's going on subsurface. We know that the center area, this area right here, appears to be previously disturbed. So what we do is we actually don't test in there. We do a much more stratigraphic approach where we come down in a plan view. Now, this misconception of previously disturbed, here's a perfect example, and I deal with this very often in my job, is that previously disturbed is not really a good indication of what's going on subsurface. So here we are dealing with a significant archaeological village that spans over 2,500 years. It had numerous individuals, up to 25 individuals that were buried here. It had active ancestral funerary areas. It had over 52 residential houses and a variety of other architectural features, all of which were in the 0 to 10 foot range of disturbance. Now, again, here we knew that there was a public need. This public need was to expand the Animal Care Center. We knew that this wasn't really a good option for avoidance because of that public need. There was a need to mitigate here in order to get that public benefit. Because if you tried to, recreate it over here, guess what? There were features over here. There were features over here. I'm just showing you kind of the densest area of where this is. However, the tribes were objected to this. I mean, this was a local project. And unfortunately, we were prioritizing dogs and cats and other animals over their ancestral resources. But what are we going to do? Are we going to relocate the entire Animal Care Center? That wasn't a viable option. So the tribes also understand that there are modern day needs, but that we should consider and plan accordingly and avoid when necessary. So, with regards to the Silverbell project, the first thing we did is a comprehensive testing, okay? We examined the distribution of cultural deposits independent of those site boundaries to understand vertically what was going on. Are we in a 0 to 5 foot horizon? Do we have cultural deposits going down to 10 feet? Now, again, this comprehensive approach is really ignorant of the impacts, the direct impacts of the project, because it was agreed upon in the plan that we want to take this opportunity to really understand comprehensively what's going on here in order to provide a document to the city of Tucson that is a planning document moving forward. So once Silverbell is done, we consider this a moratorium on this area because we're hoping that at least for the 5, 10, 20-year horizon, that this project covers any new impacts to this corridor. This project is pretty comprehensive in doing that. So in order to plan effectively, we then shift from testing and we only target areas that are not being filled so that we can avoid and protect those areas that are being filled. However, there is again, a slight need to go into some of the fill areas because we need to know if it's very shallow, guess what? That's an area we're going to target during construction to lay down a protective barrier in order to protect those shallow deposits from, let's say, construction vehicles that are just going to be driving around on the surface. And let's say they're driving around in rainy conditions. They've got these big ruts. It becomes a mud pile and boom, those ruts start sinking down and can affect those resources. So again, prioritize, minimize, and mitigate only the areas that are slated for direct ground disturbing impacts. Those are the cut and the drainage easement areas as demonstrated on here. So when we think horizontally and we think acreage, we have 38.65 acres of fill activities. 5.31, that's going to be 0 to 1.5 feet below modern ground surface. 3.11 of 1.5 to 15.86. That's as deep as this project is affecting. We've got 9.5 acres of drainage easements. But what I'd like to really draw your attention to is the calculated disturbance for utilities based off of the design plans. It is under 1 acre. And the reason for that is that currently TEP poles house several aerial utilities that are commingled on their poles. That is a huge advantage, and that was discussed during the Historic Properties Treatment Plan development and the programmatic agreement with all the tribes. And so that was a very important topic during those discussions. So here are some of the results. I'm going to take you through 2 examples. I'm not going to show you where these are for confidentiality reasons and sensitivity, but here is one context, one literally archaeological area that was going to be impacted by construction. We have 37 house structures, 200 plus architectural features, 14 ancestral burials, 1 documented funerary area, and the first ever prehistoric reservoir that has ever been documented in the Tucson Basin. We have over 2,000 years of history documented in this one site context. Therefore, people have been living here in that one area on and off for a period of 2,000 years, ancestral generations living in the same place. Next site. This site provided the most contentious thing that occurred during the pre-construction phase. At the time of the design effort, we knew that this area was going to be targeted for drainage work. What we didn't know is the sheer magnitude and importance of this one archaeological site. When we went into test, we found that we were in a formal cemetery complex. Upon that discovery, we regrouped with the tribes on behalf of the tribes and met with the City of Tucson engineers to reevaluate the plans and say, is there any way that we can not use this area and minimize the impact of this area, redesign this drainage area to preserve as much of this site as possible. We scrutinized together those engineering plans and determined that this wash that passes through here, unfortunately, it has never, ever been serviced for flood control mitigation measures. And the current development, this is private land on both sides of it, the private development that's occurring here, the private development that occurred here, private residences that are on this side, this wash was going to have to get fixed sooner or later. And this project requires that this wash have the level of intensity that the level of disturbance that it did. The tribes were let's say, didn't resent it, but understood it. And although they weren't accepting of it, they realized that this provided other opportunities of preservation in place. So we're targeting this, but we're preserving their history with as much as we can. For example, on the next segment, what resulted out of this is that we are going to be doing the survey, or not the survey, but we are going to be doing testing prior to design in order to better inform on design. That is something that wasn't actually done during the segment 2 project. So for the segment 3, Communidad Serra de Aina, we're actually going to be putting a backhoe in the ground to better inform and avoid specifically the cemetery context. While the tribes, affirm connections to these places, it's their ancestors that are the priority. Disturbing their ancestors disturbs their resting place. And I think we can all understand that. So in this one site context, just to provide you a little understanding, we have 3,000 years of human history with a significant occupation enduring for about 500 plus years, 93 residential structures, 180 architectural features, 101 ancestral burials, 5 funerary areas, 5 animal burials, and numerous agricultural features. And if anyone doesn't know, Tucson has the earliest evidence of irrigation agriculture in North America. Keep moving on here. So where does that leave us? Road projects in Tucson very rarely afford opportunities for in-place preservation due to the overwhelming necessity of connecting points A to B in a straight line. With road projects in floodplain deposits, there's an opportunity that we have capitalized on protecting deeply buried deposits underneath the roadway, as we have modern flood deposits that have capped the ancestral strata. So if you think on the east side of the river and closer to the Santa Cruz on the west side of the river, every time the Santa Cruz flooded, it dropped layers of silt, right? Those were capping the ancestral deposits. So the current roadways, or the current surface that we're building on, is elevated much higher. But when we think of where Silverbell is, it's in a transition zone. It's in this zone coming off of the mountains, dipping into the floodplain, and arguably there is much less silt capping these deposits, meaning that ancestral deposits are very shallow here. We haven't had a lot of accumulation of soils on there. With a road widening project, we are restricted by the original footprint of the road. But in the case of Silverbell, we're afforded a significant challenge in the cultural landscape in which the road was originally built. This project, however, has a significant advantage in terms of its raised design that other widening projects typically do not provide. Instead of widening from existing, the vast majority of the road is being raised, requiring the import, not the export of soils. The real impacts here result from the 18 plus ephemeral washes that cross the road, transporting water from the mountains to the river. Now, due to the development of the surrounding residential areas, these washes are in desperate need of flood control improvements, regardless of whether this road project was going to move forward. But we're commingling it all into one project. Similar to our emphasis on water in this arid desert climate, the region's ancestors settled along these washes for millennia, and therefore it is no surprise that we're encountering profound evidence of their lifeways in this corridor. From a total project standpoint, however, the scale of impacts is considerably less than most roadway projects, and we are afforded an outstanding opportunity to preserve in place their legacy. So, variance approval. This is how it would all line up. Variance denial. So pre-existing utilities that has been brought up numerous times, especially underneath the current road prism, very likely were constructed before any local considerations of impacts to cultural resources were established. One of the things that we will be doing when we go underneath the roadway is not to touch these utilities, but to see how these utilities did impact sites and features. Requiring TEP to bury their line would cause a new utility corridor, I depicted it here in yellow, in native soils that would certainly have a profound impact on ancestral resources. A new utility corridor would require a minimum of a 15-foot wide trench for the entire length of the Silverbell project due to the dependency other aerial utilities currently set on TEP's poles. There is no viable avoidance measures available with a new utility trench. Testing prioritized understanding the vertical stratigraphy, what's going on subsurface in areas that will be impacted. The full extent of buried cultural resources deposits in this area, it's unknown because we only did a targeted approach. However, geomorphological analysis, that is the study of the landform, confirms what I said before. We have very shallow deposits, definitely 0 to 5, but probably 0 to 10. We're dealing with solid cultural stratigraphy. Borings are not an option. We've already reviewed one plan from Lumens that is proposing, oh, we're just going to bore underneath the cultural strata. Well, guess what? In areas where we know where that cultural horizon is, that's great. We can do borings as an option, and we can say you've got to go down 12 to 15 feet. But in other areas, we're going, and these are limited exposures that they're the ground disturbance. I mean, we're talking maybe 50 linear feet. And what we're going to do is, no, you have to open trench because we need to actually see if you need to go this way and you cannot go aerial, this is what we're going to have to do. So for example, in this drainage easement, CenturyLink has a line that runs from Silverbell to the golf course. It's currently buried right here and it needs to be relocated. Well, they are either going to have to go aerial here to get over the drainage easement, or they're going to have to come around some other way. But most likely they're going to go aerial here. So disturbance from new poles, however, is minimal. And again, it fits with the project philosophy to consider project needs versus project options to avoid, minimize, and mitigate. Each pole location is going to be reviewed, and there is some flexibility with pole locations as strands can be lengthened and shortened to avoid specific areas of known cultural concerns. Overall, if this variance is not approved, it would cause an additional 30% increase in disturbance that had previously A, not been consulted upon, and B, the tribes would be it would put the entire project in jeopardy. So I'm almost done, guys.
Thank you, Ian. That was a great presentation.
I got one last, if it's okay, I've got one last thing.
Okay, go ahead.
So if this variance is denied, it risks affecting the 404 permit that regulates the voter approved project, and it unnecessarily destroys and disturbs ancestral resources. It sets a precedent that scenic considerations are of greater value than heritage resources, and it endangers severing project stakeholder relationships. Now look, I acknowledge that as the DRB, your mandate is to protect the scenic values of the Silverbell corridor. In this case, however, your mandate conflicts with the deep legacy of historic preservation and conservation that the county and the city of Tucson have been jointly committed to for over 30 years. The variance request before you is supported by 12 federally recognized tribal governments and 7 agency stakeholders, not because of aesthetics or economics, but because they're vested. We are all vested in the belief that place matters and that material history of places matter. In the hierarchy of values we all must consider, we must prioritize the sanctity of our region's ancestral footprint when there is an option to do so. Of course, there are modern day needs that do not allow for this to happen, but the case before you is not one of them. Approving this variance will affirm a continued commitment to stewardship that is of such vital importance for current residents and visitors, and which we hope to bestow to future generations. Thank you guys very much for allowing me to present.
Thank you, Ian.
Mr. Chair, members of the DRB, I just would like to ask Ian Milliken to please email me the materials you just presented to the DRB so I can post them in their webpage.
Happy to do so.
And I want to get a t-shirt with all those logos on it. That was very informative. Exactly the type of information that was requested, probably more so than we thought we would get.
Sorry
What's
about
next?
that.
No problem. What's next for the applicant, if anything?
What's the next item on the agenda is pertains to the other underground utilities. So, alrighty. So can you see my screen? With that?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So yeah, the questions that came up prior to were pertaining to other utilities along the alignment of Silver Bell and whether we could co-locate with utilities or if there was an opportunity to have joint trenching. We prepared an overview that shows several enlarged areas, this being one of them that illustrates the location of different utilities. We have sewer, water, underground fiber, gas lines, and then the overhead electric lines. So the presence of existing utilities, as Ian mentioned, in many cases will be capped. The work for the transportation project will be completed on top of the existing utilities, and they won't be relocating to any significant degree, certainly not along the entire length of the project. So we have the potential for conflicts with other utilities. And when those utilities like this sewer line here, this water line, when those run perpendicular to the trench, so if we're trenching along Silver Bell or trenching along the multiple use path, and we come to those areas where there's perpendicular utilities, we'll have to dive deeper, potentially impacting resources at a deeper depth to go underneath and have the required separation for those utilities. Similarly, you'll see this drainage easement here and the drainage structure where we're coming along, if we're going along Silver Bell or in the multi-use path, the drainage structure will pose a barrier that will have to either go underneath or through the fill. And there's a number of other constraints where there's congested areas. It's like along the west side of Silver Bell. If there's other utilities, again, we require separation. So we could be forced from a design standpoint to push that trench further outside of the corridor. This could do two things. That could, one, push that utility trench outside of the area of potential effect, and it could also push that trench, the extent of it, outside of the right-of-way within which we have prior rights. And pushing it outside would also create potential conflicts with drainage easements as seen here, in which case, again, we would have to go deeper underneath that drainage area to locate underground facilities. Another issue that we'll review in more detail shortly here is that culverts, there's not enough fill along the route for that conduit to be routed between the road and the top of the culvert, and it's too deep to go under. And even if there were theoretically enough fill to go on top of the culvert, it poses major challenges for sequencing. So as it's planned, TEP is planning to relocate our facilities prior to road construction. If we were to go on top of these drainage structures, it would create challenges for construction because that drainage structure would have to be installed prior to our relocation. So there'd be a conflict between timing and sequencing of construction operations. And again, the perpendicular utilities as seen along the length of Silver Bell pose a challenge for design as electrical trenches would need to go underneath those facilities. So in regards to the floodplain area, Ian mentioned there's 18 plus washes. I believe there's 22 crossings with, a major bridge that's in excess of 100 feet.
Hey, Kevin, real quick. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to interrupt just to keep things. You just changed to floodplain on utility. I just have, that was a lot of detail for this project. Are the water and sewer, they're going underground, and is their disturbance and mitigation accounted for in the chart that Ian presented to us, which was less than 1 acre?
Yeah, most of those existing utilities are underground, like the sewer line is underground currently. And the
so they don't count
count
as a disturbance if they're already there.
That's right. And so if you were to try to propose a joint trench, which you couldn't trench with sewer or water anyway, but if you were to try to present a joint trench with fiber, for example, that's already there, then that would constitute additional disturbance, as you would need to excavate a trench with separation.
Okay, thank you. And so next question is, this project, is the sewer being improved or is it remaining in place? For example.
So, the sewer is a component of the transportation design. I'll let Kyle or perhaps Jeff speak to plans as it relates to other utilities. That's outside of the purview of what TEP is planning.
I'm just trying to get a sense if they are forced into the mitigation option.
Well,
This is Kyle.
mentioned-
This is Kyle. The
Yeah,
sewer,
right.
the sewer is intermittent on the job. There's not, it doesn't run parallel with the entire job, and it is not being improved with this project. I think there's a couple of manhole rims that are being adjusted to match finished grade, but other than that, the sewer is staying intact.
Thank you. Same question for water.
There is some new water line going in. I'll let Jeff Stein with EPS Group, our consultant engineer, also speak to this. There's a couple different water components. One is a 42-inch transmission main that runs the length of the job, and it runs. Currently, it's underneath the existing road, and it will remain under the existing road. Currently, the plan is to only adjust that 42-inch transmission main where we have to, where it conflicts with some of the drainage crossings which are being undergrounded as part of this project.
So it's going in an existing trench. It's just new pipe replacing old pipe in an existing trench.
Essentially, yes. It'll be offset a little bit because you can't occupy the two areas at the same time.
Going while the new one's going in. Okay.
Well, essentially, it's maybe a little bit more in depth than that, but essentially it'll be side by side with the old one as they put in a new one and remove the old one.
And does that count as a disturbance in Ian's chart that we saw of less than 1 acre?
Yeah, Kyle, I'll answer that.
I don't believe it does. Go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, so the answer is that type of activity is not really counted as a disturbance.
Well, it's in the same location as the washes. So as we put in the culverts or the pipes underneath the road, and we're relocating the water line to get underneath those drainage channels. So yes, it is counted as disturbance in those areas. Okay,
and its tally is still in that less than 1 acre that we saw Ian put on the screen?
Correct.
And just so you know, that less than 1 acre, just to chime in, it basically is considering disturbances outside of areas that are already being disturbed by cut activities and drainage easement activities. If that makes sense.
So Ian, and I see Rosemary, you have a question. We'll get to that right in a second. So what you're saying is the water line is not in that less than 1 acre. That's considered a cut activity that was tracked in another category above?
I can't speak for, I think it's not just one fix to the water line. So I think it depends on which area you're talking about, but there is some utility relocation components that are outside of areas that would otherwise be disturbed by construction activities. That's the less than 1 acre calculation. The utility relocations that are occurring within areas that are already going to be disturbed by construction activities, those are covered by the other cut activities. Calculations.
Okay. Rosemary.
Yeah, hi. I just have two questions. I think they're primarily for Ian, and they pertain to the location of the power poles. So would all of those poles be within the area of probable disturbance?
Yes, ma'am. So the TP is limited by the area potential effects that their utility relocation must occur within the area potential effects. So it cannot go outside of that. And so, yes, it would, but it would have to be in native soils, because if you think about the roadway getting widened, the new poles would go east of that in certain sections. that's all native ground surface that would be impacted in terms of pole locations. In terms of utility trench, it would be obviously compounded in terms of the impacts.
Okay, and then how do you remediate the borings or augering needed for the power pole foundations for the new power poles?
It's a great question. So we found in consultation with the tribes that really it's difficult to mitigate an auger. So what we do is we know we'll actually go in and understand better the vertical stratigraphy. And so based off of what we know, we will be reviewing TEP's proposed pole locations. If it intersects something that is known, we will try to work with PEP to see if we have any wiggle room to kind of move it left or right, to move it into an unknown with the hopes that we minimize our impact. However, there's always a chance for impact, so we monitor the soils that are removed. And then once those soils are removed, the disturbance has occurred. The tribes say, okay, that disturbance has occurred. We documented it. Now, if there is a burial context that comes up out of that, at that point, we go in and investigate to ensure that we've removed all aspects of that burial per the burial agreement. But otherwise, it's a monitoring exercise.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the floodplain information.
Okay, so yeah, in regards to floodplain, and also pertinent to the previous discussion, you asked if there was any public comments. And so in the interest of transparency, and then on the subject of floodplain, I wanted to share a public comment that pertains to the subject. This quote references the floodplain map, which is a FEMA map also presented on the City of Tucson webpage. And there's a few locations within the floodplain that are none within the Santa Cruz River floodplain. To zoom in and provide a bit more granularity, there is a segment that does impact and interconnect with the both Zone X and Zone AE floodplain associated with the Santa Cruz River. And then the other areas pertain to the tributary washes. We will be required to have floodplain use permits for the project. There's certainly facilities in floodplain. And the member of the public that provides the comment specifies that based on his experience, there's locations where utilities are successfully placed and protected within the roadway prism. And this is very much true and is relevant for new construction where utilities can be built within the road footprint. However, in this case, as Ian pointed out, most of that is going to be mitigated through fill and managed to avoid additional impacts. So in this case, we really don't have the option to place the voltage of sub-transmission line that we're placing in the roadway prism. And in regards to the drainage, and this relates more specifically to the floodplain, where there's 100-year flow, the comment specifies that it's possible to place the power line underground such that it's protected by the drainage crossing structure. And I'll take a closer look at that. So this example here shows a location where there's a drainage structure. It's in excess of 100 feet long. Now this configuration is much easier and much more effective to span with a wire overhead where you can place two poles on either side and span the crossing without any impact to the crossing or any risk to the underground utility being routed across that drainage. Looking at the plan view above, so this drawing is a plan view as if you're looking straight down on Silver Bell Road. This is a box culvert structure or some drainage structure that's crossing underneath the road. And then you have City of Tucson lighting coming down as this dashed line. If you were to flip this sideways, and this relates back to previous discussion about reviewing existing utilities in plan and profile views, if we switch to a profile view, and this is just a very simple kind of rudimentary schematic of that crossing, if you flip that to look at it from a profile or cross-section view, so the top of the road being on top, underground, we don't have the option to route 46 kV underneath that structure. And another consideration is that the cable, the diameter of that conduit that would potentially be used for an underground application is relatively large and it can't be bent real sharply. So in order to get a conduit to that depth, if it were to have to go under something, you would have to start that cut way far away from that crossing and excavate to a depth that would, require just extensive excavation to extreme depth, would require shoring, and would just be a massive, significant excavation in order to route facilities under a drainage structure to afford that protection. The other alternatives are then to move that underground trench outside of the crossing, in which case then you're routing it under the scour protection, which would force it to a depth that is out of compliance with our specifications, or force it even further out into the native crossing, in which case you'd be outside of right-of-way, outside of the area of potential effect, and then it would be prone to the scour. There's no scour protection in that area. So from a design standpoint, it's very difficult, especially in this project with 20 crossings, to construct or design an underground utility that works in concert with all of the existing utilities and with the drainage structures. And so Jeff or Kyle, would you like to speak to the design as it relates to drainage and any potential challenges or benefits of the overhead construction as opposed to underground in relation to drainage? Okay, moving on. If there's any questions that come up on that front, we can address those. So the final item is vegetation.
This is Chris. Can you hold on 1 second on that? Is this the proper time to ask the question? If you go back one slide to where you just were.
Yes.
Is this the proper time to ask the question of what is the alternative to going under this if you were in a subterranean, if you were undergrounding and you came across this situation of, for these wash crossings, going from a junction box, going vertical, over, back down, so you'd have limited pole activity? Can you speak to that consideration of whether or not that's, even an opportunity?
Yeah, I think that certainly would avoid the need to underground through the structure. So you'd have a pole here and a pole here, and you would go underground. If I understand the question correctly, you'd go underground to a point, say, just south of the drainage, then riser up on a pole, go overhead across the crossing, and then go back underground. And while that would be technically feasible, probably not in the best interest of the project due to the number of crossings, and then you would still be introducing overhead lines. So we'd probably be having that same discussion in the context of the scenic ordinance, as there would be multiple overhead segments across the length of the project. The underground design also poses a major challenge for operations and maintenance, in that if you had underground that was then risered up, crossing underground, management of outages associated with having that underground could be really challenging. Well, technically feasible given the other circumstances surrounding the project area and the number of crossings, probably wouldn't be the best design approach.
Carol, I see your hands up. Why don't you ask your question, please?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on Chris's question. There was a neighborhood person, I can't remember who it was, but that person suggested going mostly underground and variants popping up above ground, running overhead, back down at these touchy sites. This goes back to the beginning of the project. Sorry, you guys. Why are we jumping sides of road with the poles? Why aren't we staying on the west side?
The west side has topography and hill slopes that would require major excavation if TEP were to maintain facilities on the west side. That would require us to move those facilities and relocate and modify the structures, and that would require, significant excavation and impact to those hillsides, which would pose potential, aesthetic conflicts as well as conflicts with the archaeology in that area. Now, Jaime, do you want to? I know we've talked about that in the past. Do you want to provide any comments about, why staying on the west side from Sweetwater Drive south to Goree is not a viable option?
Hello, everybody. Jaime Reyes, project manager with Tucson Electric Power. That is exactly correct there, Kevin. There wasn't a lot of disturbance for the roadway project on the west side of the project for that area, so not a lot of study, not a lot of coordination was involved there. So the crossing there made absolute sense, since the studies and everything that goes with this project was done to clear that area for the transition from the west side to the east side there.
Okay, another question. What is the average fill depth on the new sections of roads? What is the average fill? Since this is primarily a fill project, what is the average fill depth for the roadway itself? Can you say?
Kevin, you want me to address that?
Yeah, Jeff, that'd be a good design question.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jeff Stein with EPS Group, the design engineer on the project. I haven't calculated it, but I'm going to estimate it to be a good 2 to 4 feet on an average. Some areas get a little deeper. Obviously, where we're putting in drainage culverts, it could be up to 8 to 10 feet, and then just some areas that I'm going to say it could be as little as 2 feet or less. But average, I mean, you're probably in the 3 to 4 foot range.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the questions. And so moving along into the vegetation subject, this slide shows the visual simulation. The left image is the current conditions. The right image is the designed future conditions. That also includes the landscaping from the landscaping plan. Now, as you'll note, the landscaping is generally compatible with the existing and planned infrastructure. The heights for the lowest points on the new system will be in the range of 20 to 23 feet. So the vegetation that's proposed as part of the landscaping plan is generally compatible with that, and the species themselves are compatible with light trimming. So if there is the need to trim vegetation, then that can be done so without negatively impacting the various species prescribed for the vegetation plan. Now, something to keep in mind is that an underground design would require a substantial change to the native plant preservation plan, as well as the landscaping plan. If you were to trench along the length of the project to the extent that would be required to install the underground electric utility, you would have to conduct significant vegetation clearing, where the current design has a native plant preservation plan that can be more, improved and integrated with TEP's pole locations. So we have our pole locations and the native plant preservation plan, and those two things can be more seamlessly integrated. Whereas, again, an underground trench would just require complete clearing of all existing native plants. And Kyle had provided the city of Tucson has prepared both the landscaping plan and the native plant preservation plan. TEP is working in conjunction with those stakeholders to integrate our design into those plans. So those are city plans, and if there's anyone from the city or any questions pertinent to those, perhaps the folks that develop those plans could address those. And with that, I'll close by saying again, thank you for your consideration and continued discussion about this project. Understanding it is very complex in the nature of it, in terms of that there's multiple project stakeholders that worked collaboratively to develop this integrated project plan. I do believe that this plan will greatly improve the safety, functionality, and aesthetics of Silver Bell Road, and that the utility infrastructure is integrated with the transportation design for this more cohesive and consistent modernized Silver Bell Road corridor. And it's also included, as Ian illustrated, to afford the least impact to the valuable cultural resources that are located along the length of the project area. So with that, we'll transition to discussion and open it up to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Kevin, thank you very much. That is, I think, easily the most complete presentation that this design review board has had on any application. And I think it was, requested and required by the design review board. We can't just put our toe in the water and make a good decision. And so I really thank Ian and Kevin for taking the time this last couple of weeks. I know that wasn't a small matter to get all that together. And so just to let you know, I appreciate it. Design Review Board, let's take a few minutes to maybe Maria, if that's your screen, if you could put the criteria up again. Last time we met, the sticking point in my mind revolved around number 4, that granting, that there could be, is that right, number 4? I'm thinking of the one that says special privilege. We don't want to grant number 3, special privilege. That was my sticking point. And now that I've heard more details and are brought up to speed more, I think I can appreciate that privilege is not really a word I would associate with TEP's scope of work. I would more say that they're in a cooperation with some complex priorities and requirements for what I call project restraints. They're dealing with project restraints. And so I have a better understanding of that now. Looking at these 7, is there any condition here that you find that we are not meeting with this presentation? Rosemary.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Nathan, I echo your gratitude. I think it was great to have all this information presented, and it really does help us make our decision easier. There is one piece that we had requested, and it is the landscape. And, we didn't really have any discussion on that. Is there someone from the city who can discuss the landscape plan for this project?
This is Kyle DeWitt with the city of Tucson. I asked Scott Martinez with Gannon Associates to attend, and I believe he's on the line. They developed a landscape and the NPP plan for this project. Scott, are you there?
I am here, yes. Hi, thanks for the opportunity to come to the meeting today. As you can see, it's a very complex project, and we're as a landscape architect, we have the challenge of getting to work with all these different constraints and utilities and roadways and clear zones and site visibility issues that if you see a roadway that doesn't have trees or something nice in it, there's usually a reason. It's not because we didn't want to put something there. It's because there's something in the way that you can't see, or something that's underground, or even overhead power lines. So this plan that we put together for Silver Bell Road is in compliance with the city's native plant preservation plan. We've also prepared environmental resource reports for each of the wash crossings, and also, since this project, the original scope of the project during the DCR phase from grant to INA goes through multiple jurisdictions, we utilized the county's environmentally sensitive design guidelines for this project. So there's some specific requirements for using native plants, water efficient irrigation systems, as well as incorporating any setbacks from utilities and other things. But for this project in particular, we've inventoried the entire disturbance area. I think there's over 1,200 plants that were inventoried that may be either preserved or transplanted or mitigated. The landscape plan, I have, I can share.
Thank you. Yeah, if you could share the plans, that would be helpful.
Yeah. The construction plans are a little bit boring, but I can show you. We have some exhibits that were prepared early on for public meetings.
I'd like to see the plans, please.
Yes. So this is coming at from the north side of the project, moving south. This is at Camino del Cerro. Just kind of step through these. So anything that's disturbed as far as soil will be hydroseeded with the native hydroseed mix outside of the sidewalks and multi-use path. In between the roadway, between the sidewalks and in the medians will be surfaced with a aggregate surfacing like a decomposed granite or rock mulch. And you see we have quite a few plants planting where there's room and where there's no utility constraints.
So Scott, this is Chris Stevie. I have a quick question for Ian based on this plan you're showing. I'm seeing multiple plant relocations that look to be outside the limits of grading or on the fringes of the limits of grading. Are those areas included, or were they strategic? These plantings, they look like maybe transplants from the native plant, or their relocations. Are those considered in this impact area? Considering that if there are actually, hold on, Scott, are there plans to actually TOS anything on this site, or is it a typical city native plant where you do the mitigation only and not transplant?
We proposed about 100 or so plants to be mitigated, and the problem with this one was due to the long timeline between the archaeological, preliminary research.
Right.
So yeah, there wasn't an easy way to transplant.
No TOS, right?
Yeah. So
right,
there.
Right, okay.
I think like cactus there will be, but not trees. So.
Okay. So that limits my question a little bit of that. We're not doing spades. We're not doing 42-inch spades outside of this limit of work. That I'm concerned about. The tree planting outside of this is going to be a surface disturbance that was pretty much the highlight of the archaeological presentation earlier.
Correct. And looking at the plans, what it does not show is our easement line. So where it does jut out here beyond the cut fill, the easements for drainage ways have not been, I think they've been either turned off or they're not showing up. But where you're seeing that's typically where there's a drainage crossing. This symbol is for preserve in place plants, and then so if you see that symbol, we just want to make sure they're not going to impact stuff that's on the fringes of the disturbance areas. This is Sweetwater Drive here.
Just one thing, these plans are not reflective of the APE boundary, the area potential effects boundary, but all of this is within the area potential effects. And the archaeologists have reviewed all of the entire plan, and we are adequately planning for any of those disturbance areas where new plantings would occur.
Okay, so I have a clarification. Your fill line, let's say, shown on the south side, that is inside the area of effect?
Correct, because every single action that you have heard today, whether it's construction, utilities, plants, work, anything, is all within that cage.
Right. For instance, you'll see this, it looks pretty dense here, and it's more of a, meeting the ER, the environmental resource report, and mitigating for the riparian areas per the city's code. So sometimes we're fighting for room to to get those all in, but for sure we
Okay,
are.
could you show me where the new TEP poles would be in this sheet? If possible. I don't see them on the sheet. Where are they?
Let's see.
In this segment of roadway, the poles would be on the east side of the road, or what's the top of that sheet, because this is south of Sweetwater.
Okay.
Yeah, Sweetwater is, I think I just went past it. Here, this is Sweetwater Drive here. I believe it crosses here. Is that correct, Kevin?
That is correct, yes.
And then, from what my understanding is, it follows the near the multi-use path. But as far as the exact location of the poles, I'm not sure that was in this plan set. I think it was from 2019 is our last.
Well, I thought the NPPO plans and the landscape plans were integrated with the pole locations.
Yeah, well, they're all within the disturbance area boundary, so.
Okay.
And this request for variance, I don't see the, critical nature of the landscape plan. It's not one of the criteria that we're evaluating right now, although it is of interest to our group. That's a nice.
I feel it would help mitigate the eyesore of having electrical lines on both sides of the street if we permit this variance.
Gotcha.
Mr. Kapler, members of the DRC, under the DRB's purview, it does say that the DRB recommendation shall apply the same findings required, in that section for the Board of Adjustment. But also the DRB may make any recommendation that would assist in mitigating any negative impacts which might occur should the request be granted.
All right, so Carol's right on track here.
That's right. And I just have one other question that also pertains to this. How many new shade trees are being added along the MUP?
Along the MUP, well, I know there's 800 trees total. And I haven't done a count of exactly how many are along the path, so I could figure that out for you and get that.
But it's extensive. It's the
Yeah.
trees are to provide shade, and those trees are also along the same side of the street with the new power poles.
Yeah,
correct.
We don't. I was trying to get at that, Rosemary, to see if I could see that, but I can't figure it out.
Let me see.
I think what we're hearing is they're trying to cram in all the required trees wherever they can, given the constraints. So it's possible they'll be on both sides of the street with the co-located with the poles and opposite the poles. They're putting it, the challenge was finding the space to put them all in. Is that right, Scott? Is that why you have tight clusters?
There's, with the utilities and everything else and constraints, we put the trees where, with the room that's left after everybody else has kind of been done. As you can see, there's some major drainage improvements where, we can't plant some things, but where we are able to plant next to the path, we do. But I mean, obviously there's some openings and spaces, which I think are nice for having gaps along.
Right.
And then just have
It's unfortunate that the trees are located such that they're north of the MUP path and will not be providing a lot of shade on the MUP path.
Yeah, I believe, I know, I've been working with the county a lot, and if you can believe it, the setback on the loop paths are 17 feet. We can't plant a tree within 70 feet to 17 feet of the path. And also, I think I've tried to get them, I've got it as down as low as 8 feet. So, and this has been a recent request from projects from flood control and
Yeah.
So-
What I've
so-
done in the past is relocate the MUP path, swing it away from the curb line to the south side, the side of the trees that the trees provide some shade, and then curve it back to the road when you're at an intersection.
So
Yeah,
with,
Go
with
ahead.
regards to the loop path, I will say that one of the things that you're probably running up against with having trees closer is that much of the loop path is commingled with a wastewater line running underneath of it. And so it's a maintenance path, and it's also a protective measure for the wastewater line from root structures impeding on that line.
Right. So you have offsets.
Yep.
And as far as meandering the path too, it's kind of that we're under the same gun with that. You know, we're limited in where we can find those areas within the right of way to, you know, there may be some that were used, but I think that the more we push out, the further disturbance we're going to cause. But
So where are the new TEP poles? Gosh.
no, I know. I don't know that
They're not shown on here?
shown on this one
Oh,
that I have up. So
that's okay. I understand. There's a lot. This is a complicated project.
yeah, they may be in my AutoCAD drawing that I could bring up if that helps. So.
Well,
Is it, this is Steve Dolan. Is the public going to have any more opportunity to make a few comments?
not on today's agenda, I don't believe. We can look at the agenda, but I don't think I think there might be at the very, very end, but not before the DRB makes its vote or makes its motion.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I want to explore the landscaping a little bit more, but I also want to do a little time check here. It's 9:30 and there are a couple other cases on the agenda, and the lion's share of the presentation having to do with archaeology. Yeah. I see a hand up there.
Hi.
Susanna.
Yeah, I apologize if this has been presented, but I wasn't at the last presentation. I understand the archaeological and the infrastructural aspects. I guess I was just looking at some of the additional plans online. I'm just a little confused about where, I understand the TEP poles are shifting from side of the road to side of the road, but it seems that primarily they're just on one side of the road and they're crossing at certain points, and they're not on both sides of the road, right? Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
I believe that at some point there'll be poles because of the city of Tucson street lighting and the TE poles, that there's going to be a pretty long section of road in which poles are going to be on both sides.
But the street light poles are a lot smaller than these big TEP poles. So in a sense,
yeah.
So these are larger TEP poles than currently exist.
Giant.
But they are going to be just on one side of it. So was there an explanation why we need so much larger ones?
You are correct in that they will only be on the one side of the road. So they'll be on the west side of the road from Camino del Cerro to Sweetwater, and then the entire line will shift to the east side and be on the east side of the road from Sweetwater to a point just north of Goree, at which point it'll transition back and reconnect to the existing line. And any height increase in the designed poles is required in order to accommodate the height of the city streetlights that are proposed. So our poles are sized in conjunction with the street lighting for adequate clearance.
Can someone from the city confirm that? Because I've seen a lot of these high poles and they're way higher than the street lights. I mean, the electrical wires.
Yeah,
This is Kyle
I
with the
guess
city. I'm not following the question.
Can you confirm that you're not actually needing more electricity then? You're saying it's the city street lights that are driving your size of your poles.
yeah, Kyle, they're 40-foot light standard, correct, on the design for the city?
I don't have that memorized off the top of my head, Kevin. Jeff, do you remember the size of those poles?
35 foot pops out in my head. I don't know exactly, but for some reason I'm thinking 35 foot. So.
Could I just want to run this image through everybody's minds. Okay, so if our road is going to be filled 3 to 4 feet fill, but our trench is 4 feet deep with a 3.5 foot required clearance above the 6-inch conduit for the thing. So if would it be possible, or am I just not seeing the picture here, that we run our conduit under the road where we already have 3 to 4 feet typically? And
Carol,
then,
that's the exact question I had my hand up to ask, is if we're doing 2 to 4 feet of fill, can't we bury the lines in those areas of fill?
Right.
To just real quickly on that, and maybe somebody else can, maybe Kevin or Jaime or Jeff, you could talk to that also. But the utility relocation is a phase that occurs before the roadway construction. So the two can't happen at the same time. The fill has to go in as they reconstruct the roadway. The utilities are getting relocated prior to that. The TEP and the communication overhead lines have to occur before the roadway construction, so they are clear and free by the time they do the roadway. Carol, I see you shaking your head. I do not understand. I mean, is that not clear or?
Oh, I am understanding, but given the sensitivity of this project and all the different stakeholders and the concerns, and they're all valid, is it indeed we're going to take this project because of standard construction processes and not perhaps address a solution to this problem because of standard ways of doing things?
I think another point to keep in mind is that in addition to the trench and conduit required for the underground infrastructure, there's a vault requirement to have pole boxes and junction boxes, and those are much deeper and much larger and could not be constructed underneath the roadway per the design. So that would really preclude it from being a viable design option.
Well, what about the idea of mostly underground and popping up at the where we need variances, where you have to go really deep, or where you have to put pull boxes? I mean, we're not here to design this project, but this project seems very unique, and perhaps unique design solutions should be further pursued.
Yeah, I mean, any contemplation of those different designs would require excavation and significant excavation,
right,
which would then conflict with resources per Ian's presentation and material and research and work to date. And
well, I don't understand that if we're looking at a 3 to 4 foot fill on the road.
Yeah, I mean, there's 4 foot clearance with depth and concrete encased 46,000 volt wire, and routing that underneath the roadway and connecting 2 vaults along the length of the roadway and then sequencing that with construction, that contemplation would have multiple conflicts and challenges that would really prevent that from being either A, in compliance with electrical standards, or B, just being functional from a constructability standpoint.
So in summary, it'd create undue hardship to the project.
Kevin,
it would create a lot of impact and undue hardship, yeah, to as well. So I think, if there's any additional comments.
Kevin, I'm happy to weigh in. This is Jeff Stein, design engineer.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think through the constructability of it. So typically how it happens is they'll build the box culverts, the drainage culverts first, say, a couple feet into the ground. Then they would put the fill on top of the box culverts and road. So just constructability and timing wise, Kevin, and you've brought that up, would TEP have to get in there and build underneath the proposed box culverts and then let the fill be brought in for the road, and then constructing the fill, and then you bring in the vaults questions. It's hard for me to kind of imagine that would be constructible with the nature that we have here.
Hey, Jeff, this is Chris Stevie again. To play devil's advocate on that, is there a provision that the existing overhead electric poles through this corridor would need to be decommissioned and removed prior to the activities you just mentioned, i.e. would it be applicable or have an opportunity that TEP could drop those conduits in as blank conduit and then fish wire as if we were fishing wire in any other condition, just happens to be a giant wire instead of a smaller wire? There's no need there. I'm not sure in the construction sequencing if there's a need that they have to build this facility in working order right off the bat. Is that out of line?
That's probably outside of my area of expertise as far as how TEP goes about, fishing their wire through their phase conduit. I don't know, Jaime, do you have any?
I guess this gets to the bottom of the question is if all other, I think there's a question within the purview of this board of the variance that all other options have been explored to avoid requiring this variance. This is an option that I don't feel is explored at this time, just from the responses I'm getting.
Well, let me discuss that a little bit with you, Chris and Carol. If you're proposing this option, maybe they can put it underground under the road.
I'm not proposing an option, Nate. We're not allowed to propose options. I'm fishing for, has every option that is available to this project been explored and identified?
Well, how is that different from a cultural resource standpoint? Because we've already heard that excavating underground would require the mitigation, and they're trying to minimize or avoid disturbing those resources, right? That's what they're trying to do. So you guys are saying, well, what about underneath the road? Well, how's that any different in your mind? If they came back to you and said we can do it, we would still be caught up on their cultural resources.
But not so much, Nathan, because we're already looking at 3 to 4 feet fill of road, if I'm understanding things correctly.
I think that's true. They would still be going down the 6 feet.
But
under the box,
to the bottom of the box, they may be going down 4.5 feet to get their 4-foot requirement in and the asphalt profile.
So,
right?
You would say 10% of the potential impact, but we would probably have 100% of the mitigation. I don't see, in my mind, it's not, in my mind, it's not a big save unless I'm missing something.
I think something else to keep in mind in regard to the existing roadway is laying conduit in the existing roadway then introduces the potential conflicts with all of the other existing utilities. So I've provided the overlay of all of the existing utilities overlaid from CAD onto the aerial imagery. And you'll see, as we see on some of the insets, there's extensive existing infrastructure with sewer, water, fiber, TV, cable, all running at opposing angles throughout the roadway. So routing an electric utility trench and conduit along in consideration of those other existing utilities would pose design challenges, which again would push that design and did push it out of compatibility with archaeological resource avoidance, and then also would push it outside of engineering standards and specifications that are allowed, or would require extensive depths and shoring that would be just extreme excavations beyond the scope of any real viable constructible design. And then if you did construct a trench, say just hypothetically, if you did construct a trench that was just massively deep, it would, the maintenance and operations of that trench would pose major issues for reliability for all of the homeowners in that area. So for example, if you have an outage, which now may last several hours, you have to completely de-energize the line before you can ship concrete away from a encased conduit. There could be extensive outages, which would pose really undue burdens on that area and really require then redesigning of the electrical grid to backfeed, et cetera, et cetera. So, if you were to explore, and those options have been explored, different alternatives, those alternatives become not viable in the context of archaeological compliance, in the context of engineering design, in the context of safety, and the best interest of the public as far as reliability for ongoing operations and maintenance. So those are just some contemplations, but harken back to that extensive existing utility infrastructure in the roadway when thinking about routing a new line underneath it or through it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Chris
and just to add to that, Jaime Reyes here, project manager again, we would not put that 46 kV line underneath the road. It would have to be offset. Again, for the event of maintenance, failure, things like that, we need to access. The one thing we don't want to do is close up traffic on Silver Bell. Again, that's a 4-foot trench. That's almost a whole lane or more that we would take there. So our lines, if again we request to be underground, would be on the joint use path, which would then eat up into the vegetation plan, things of that nature, because we would need a clear slate for us to be able to maintain that in case of a line failure there.
So thank you. So Chris and Carol, I mean, I think that.
Hey, Nate, I think
Chris.
the discussion, the point of my questioning of that topic was to get the discussion we just had.
Great. Yeah. What we want as a design review board is, facts and information on our side, and we are getting those facts and information. And so, Carol, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No,
Oh,
I'm just.
Susanna, do you have a question?
Yeah, I still want an answer to my question. I mean, it just seems fundamental that I don't believe the options of the street lights making these poles so high is a good enough reason, without information or someone clarifying that. It just seems ridiculous that the street lights are driving supposedly this size of the pole. I mean, I'm sure if the pole size was more similar to the existing, it wouldn't be such an issue with the neighborhoods, at least. So
Susana, Jaime Reyes again, TEP. I'll try to do some justice to that. So we are governed by the NESC on our clearances. And so we have to get proper clearances in what we call the worst case scenario. So our lines have SAG that comes with it. So depending on the usage, how much capacity is being utilized at the time. So those lines then tend to sag with the heat and with the capacity of it. And so as they sag and they swing, we have to have, again, governed by the NESC, we have to have proper clearances to those street lights or whatever is being installed by the city. And so we take the street lights that were proposed are going to be installed. We take our conductor and our anticipated worst case scenario. And so then we at that point take our best, we do our calculations to best adjust and best accommodate those street lights. So that is, again, trying to do it as best as I can. I'm not a designer, but that's the review process and the intent of how we size our poles.
Yeah, but it seems like there should be a drawing showing that. And how come it works without them being so big at the current level? You know, I mean, just space.
I don't believe that there's currently any streetlights there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's streetlights to be in conflict with our poles right now. So with the addition of these streetlights, then drives the size of our poles.
And so why do we need the street lights? Because it's a bigger road?
I think that's a Jeff question, Jeff or Kyle question there. Sorry, guys.
The street lighting is part of the overall plan that has been developed for this project, going all the way back to the design concept report that was developed in 2011 as part of the RTA voter approved package for these regional improvements such as Silver Bell. It's got to do with safety issues.
Well, there's studies that say that doesn't do anything to safety. And we also have the night sky ordinance, you know, so it just seems that should be something that should be looked at as that is driving a lot of this issue.
If we did not have street lights, how tall would those poles need to be without the street light?
I don't have the top of my head, but it's something that we can definitely look at. I imagine it'd be similar to what we have now.
You believe it would be similar to the existing poles?
I imagine so, but don't quote me on that. We'd have to get our engineers to make sure that, you know, it clears the trees, clears everything that's out there.
So, and what's the difference in the height now and the proposed height, Kevin?
It's roughly about a 10-foot height increase. So, you know, even if removing the streetlights, considering that scenario, you know, the height, you're not going to drop too significantly in height. And I think
Nate,
another point to consider too. Oh, go ahead.
On the point you were just making, is that these are approximately 40-foot poles?
No, the new poles are about 65 feet, and the existing poles are about 55 feet.
Oh, it was the oh
no, the
lighting poles
were
the street lightings were 40 foot, right?
35, I think.
That's right. Yeah,
35, 40, depending on topography, right? To kind of add on to Rosemary's point, we're being informed that the height of the new transmission lines is somewhat being affected by light pole proximity for the street lighting. I have not seen a diagram or any graphic showing locations of light poles versus the power poles. Are light poles located on both sides of the street, or are they on one side of the street with a with an overhang? And if that is the case, do they need to be on the same side of the street the whole way, or can they be offset left side, right side, depending on where the larger transmission poles are, so we could at least try to express a relief of 10 feet on these poles?
Well, or in the median or whatever, yeah.
There's options there.
The city
so
does
if you
have
haven't noticed, the thing I'm kind of hitting on every time I ask a question is whether or not an option to provide any relief or an option of a design alternative has been expressed or investigated by this project team. That is part of the variance process, that it needs to be clear and expressed within the variance that all options and variable in the design has been explored, and that the options being issued for variance, the relief being requested, is the minimum relief required to get the project through, right?
That's right, Chris. That's right. I want to point out, I got a message from member Rosemary. She's got a hard stop in about 10 minutes. And Rosemary, if you want to just have you might miss the motion, but if you want to express your opinion while you still have time, I'd like to give you that time right now.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So yeah, just again, I do appreciate all the work that's gone into these presentations today. It has helped us to really round out our decision-making process. And I appreciate that Tucson Electric Power is a great community partner. You guys support so many community programs, and we're not here to make your work more difficult. I think we just want to make sure that we do our due diligence for the community. And, there are a lot of factors here. We're looking at the view corridor, we're looking at cultural resources, and, we're not going to be able to make a decision that makes everyone happy, unfortunately. So I just want to say that looking at all of the constraints, it seems like cultural resources is the biggest one to my mind. And I think, looking at that, it would be a shame to increase the amount of destruction to cultural resources in favor of burying lines, given that it just doesn't seem like a viable option. So that's just my 2 cents. Thanks for letting me do that.
Thanks, Rosemary. Susanna, your hand appears to be up. Not
That's
anymore.
a mistake, sorry.
That's okay. Well, maybe DRB, we're at a point where someone wants to make a motion of approval or denial recommendation. And we can also put some consideration in there. I'll share my point of view. My point of view is we do have enough information now, specifically with cultural resources, that in my opinion, a variance would not constitute a special privilege. And that was my whole sticking point when we first were introduced to this project. It was kind of like a foregone conclusion, we're going above ground. And it's like, well, what about all the other utilities? And yeah, it's a culturally sensitive area, but we didn't get the details that Ian gave us, and so I don't think it is. I no longer believe that there's a special privilege being granted by a potential variance.
I would just say that may be true, Nathan, but I still think there is work to be done on this project in terms of just the basic option with these light versus the electric poles. And we should have that comprehensive drawing to try and mitigate to try and mitigate the kind of negative consequences for all the parties involved.
So perhaps the DRB may make a recommendation that would assist in mitigating negative impacts. So maybe we make a recommendation that further investigation of pole size and light pole location be presented. I don't know to who, but maybe to us.
Yeah, to us in the future before a variance is. I feel like pretty strongly that we should do this before we decide on the variance.
That information too, for consideration, could be presented to the Board of Adjustments. The city does have a comprehensive street lighting plan, and that's what TEP is using as the basis for our design. So that's something that the city internally could review and discuss the street lighting plan. And then for the Board of Adjustment hearing, that could be an item that we address per your recommended measure.
Nathan, if I may say, along the lines of what Suzanne is saying, I think there is more work to be done in terms of the landscape being integrated better with the location of these new poles. I would like to see that. So I think there is more work that could be done, both Suzanne's point and perhaps a landscape plans that show that where these big poles are going.
Mr. Chair, members of the DRB, Roslyn, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here. I'd like to point out that the Board of Adjustment meets next Wednesday, and they can make their decision with or without your recommendation. So if you're wanting TEP to come back to you, the Board of Adjustment will have met prior to that, and will have made its decision most likely.
So team, let's get our voice heard by the Board of Adjusters by making a recommendation and then making a few comments of what we think is incomplete so far. So at least they hear us. Otherwise, we're just going to get a incomplete is what we're going to get if we don't do it. That's what I'm hearing.
Well, but why do we even exist if they're just going to go ahead without us doing anything?
Well, that's a great question. We're just making a recommendation. We're just a part of the decision tree. That's it. We are not the deciders. We're part of the decision tree.
But if we're asking for more time, then maybe they should have more, put it on their next agenda or whatever. It's like, there's still a process, right, that has to be followed.
So what we could say is the DRB was not able to make a informed recommendation of approval or denial. We see these things as still needing to be flushed out, X, Y, and Z. We would, so we can't perform our jobs. We're not able to perform our duty. Is that what you're saying, Susanna?
Well, I don't understand this other board's role and why they're on, I understand they don't have to, we're not a decision-making group, but we're an advisory group, and if we are requiring more time and more documentation, you'd have thought there'd be respect for that. Otherwise, I do think we need to make a statement saying what we needed, but I don't understand. Maybe the person who is here can clarify why they're just going to go ahead if we don't feel we're ready.
Yes, Ms. Dixon, the Board of Adjustment, the hearing is scheduled a certain time period after they have their public meetings, and the board may make a decision to continue if they need additional information. From the time of the application until the time of the hearing, information is gathered. When it's a variance related to scenic corridor, a month is given for the DRB to meet. That allows for 2 separate meetings. One to review, and if they need it to be continued to get additional information, it allows for that timing to occur, and that's what has occurred. And then the board is still on track to meet the time frame for the submittal and the decision-making process that the applicant desires. They submitted an application, and there's a certain necessity for the board to take action within a reasonable time frame.
Ms. Wells, this is Carol Clement. May I ask the question, have you ever seen the Board of Adjustments, I think I have that name right, give extra time?
Not to go back to the DRB, because generally the DRB is given 1 full month, which is longer than they're given. They can continue their hearing for no more than 60 days, 90 days, when there is something like a revision to a plan that requires plan review. So they're given generally about 60 days to take their action. They can extend it up to, I believe 90 days. I need to look at the rules. But that's only when there's something very significant, like you have to go through another plan review process and come back with additional information.
Roslyn, I am looking at the required actions by the DRB, and let me share my. Is people able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So it says applications reviewed for the purposes of providing a recommendation to another board, committee, official, or the mayor and council for a decision shall be forwarded without a recommendation should the DRB fail to act within 21 days of the date a plan is accepted for review by the DRB. action by the DRB to continue deliberation to another meeting shall stay the 21-day requirement.
Which we've done. We have,
Yeah.
we've taken action to continue. We did that 2 weeks ago.
It was 3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago. Well, I think for us to have the most impact as a design review board, we should put a statement in front of the Board of Adjustments. And the statement can be based on the information that we have now. We can say the information that we wish we had, but we don't have, and ask them to look into it. You know, we could ask them to confirm that the pole heights are the absolute minimum required. And we note that the requirement of pole height is being driven by city lights. And if there could be some coordination of those two poles, there may be an opportunity to reduce the power pole height. Now, we could make that statement without having seen the standard detail. We can make that statement so that our board has done our duty, because we know that there's a potential reduction here, and we want that in front of the Board of Adjustment. That's what I'm in favor of.
So would we still vote for the variance?
It would be a motion. We would make a motion.
But we could deny the variance because we couldn't make a decision based on this information that you just said, right?
And we could also do the vice versa. We could approve it with the contingency that somebody verify that we have the absolute minimum pole height. That way, when they install these giant 65-foot poles, and someone investigates and they see that the design review board approved these, at least we have this comment in there.
Yeah, but wouldn't the comment be stronger if it was a denied variance based on blah, blah, blah?
Not in my opinion, because there's the recommendation and there's the comment. And the comment will be there.
Well, I think we
Nate.
need, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Susanna, then Chris.
Just,
Thank you.
I think we would have to clarify that there isn't coordinated drawings with landscape, TEP, and lighting, but also not keep it as simple as saying this pole height is driven by this lighting, but kind of question the amount of lighting we need in this situation. Because I just don't want, say, a person to say, yeah, our street lights are this high, so this is this height. To say that the design of the lighting on this street needs to be coordinated with electrical, and that, you know, maybe it doesn't have to be a standard lighting situation for in our circuit, so I just want to make sure that someone with some design sensitivity and flexibility is actually looking at this. That it isn't just a matter of looking at the heights of poles, for instance.
And I can speak to that in that there is absolutely a coordinated effort. There is an existing City of Tucson street lighting plan, which Jeff or Kyle could speak to, and engineers have designed TEP structures in strict accord with the NESC standards as well as the existing street lighting plan. And those two are very well integrated in very detailed CAD modeling to ensure compliance with clearance limits and to make sure that they're compatible. So the street lighting plan is the city design component that TEP has been designing around, and those two are very well integrated. So perhaps Kyle or Jeff, would you like to speak to the street lighting plan?
Kevin, I just want to interject here, just for expediency. This is what I think I'm hearing from the board, and I agree with it. We noticed that the pole height of 65 feet was not thoroughly justified in the presentation, and we would like the Board of Adjustment to allow only the minimum height required for each and every pole. That could be something that we attach to our motion.
And also that the city reevaluates their lighting plan for this street.
Okay, and then we could say we also feel the city should evaluate minimizing streetlights.
In this area, yeah. Because I understand you guys have worked with this, but that's what I'm questioning, that maybe the city needs to reevaluate their lighting plan for this street.
Okay, city should reevaluate the street lights in connection with reducing overall pole heights. Pole heights. I'm trying to get to a motion that we can feel good about putting our names on, or at least a majority of us. Chris.
I kind of want to narrow the focus here to, we're talking about heights of poles and I guess design qualities of the above ground poles. The variance in front of us isn't necessarily for the aesthetic of the poles. It's whether or not they have above ground versus the code required scenic corridor below ground running of electrical. Correct, Maria? I want to refocus our, if we're starting to talk about motions, what we're actually motioning on. We are motioning on the variance that will allow TEP to utilize above ground poles in a scenic corridor where per code they are requested to be subterranean. Correct? That's the relief they're asking for.
That is correct, Mr. Steve, Mr. Chair, members of the DRB. And the second portion is that the DRB may make any recommendation that would assist in mitigating any negative impacts which might occur should the request be granted.
Correct. So, Nate, I think our purview is, and gauging where we're at, below ground location of the utility poles or of underground utilities for TEP per this variance request, we're edging towards saying, yes, that's an appropriate variance, correct? And then the discussion we're currently having is how do they execute that request, right?
Yep, and this is where I'm leaning towards finding the project in compliance with the criteria and subject to the following conditions. I don't know if these are conditions, but we would say subject to confirming that 65 feet is the absolute minimum height that is going to be needed. We want them to confirm that. And confirming that the street lights proposed in the project are the absolute minimum needed for street lights. Those two things would mitigate the negative impact of having overhead power.
Also, if I may add, Nathan, that the landscape plans perhaps be adjusted to further help mitigate the negative visual impacts of the.
Well, what do you mean? What do you mean adjust the plans? You want to?
Well, for example, I don't know where those light poles are on the plan, so I don't know what the relationship between the trees and the light poles.
But presumably in the construction documents, this is all going to be located. We just don't have the full construction documents in front of us, and I bet you it's 500 pages. of documents.
But we looked at the landscape plans and there were no poles shown. So how do I know that perhaps they're being sensitive to the use of landscape trees to help mitigate the visual
Okay.
impact?
So that's a good suggestion. What we could say is we would recommend optimizing the landscape material at the pole locations.
To help mitigate, yes, help ease the eyesore. Yeah, that would be helpful.
Just like to add a comment, we have a 25-foot offset to plant any trees next to any poles, so.
For lay down, right?
What is it with you and your offsets, Scott?
That's all I got to work with.
Well, it's still,
Yeah.
it would.
Everywhere that we want to plant a tree, there's an offset. Let's just get that out on the table.
Yeah, we
It's
know.
my world. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah. Welcome to the landscaper world, Nate.
So do we
Carol, on
want-
your point, I'm not sure tree locations are going to help the eyesore of a 65-foot tower with poles, but that's just a sidebar.
I'm going to.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
members of the board, I would like the DRB in finalizing their motion to consider how the Board of Adjustment would take action on that. For example, recommend optimizing landscape at pole locations. What does that mean?
Placement of trees.
I don't know what it means.
What is optimizing placement of trees? The Board of Adjustment they're not landscapers. They're not landscape architects. So the language probably needs to be more directive to be effective.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, Rosalind. And we don't have the wherewithal to actually do the design. So we need to make recommendations that are design oriented that would assist in mitigating negative impacts. One recommendation would be to reduce the pole height and reduce the city street lights. That's pretty concrete, or at least someone could take action on that. They could say, we're gonna, right now we have 100 city street lights, and now I think we can get away with 80. So that's a 20% reduction. That's what we're thinking of, but I can't tell you if you can remove 20 of those lights.
Mr.
If
Chair,
there's only one light, Nate, we probably still have the same requirement for height. The poles are the poles, and if there's poles in conflict, one in conflict is enough to change the height of this entire string of lights, right?
Yeah.
It's
Mr.
reducing
Chair,
them by
I'd also
10%
like
isn't going to do anything for the condition we're in. It's the location,
it's
physical location of the lights.
And it's only a 10-foot increase from what I have heard at this meeting. It's from 55 to 65.
Yeah, and I want to be clear on that. Just there's a range, and those heights vary based on topography, and that it's not only streetlights, that there's also poles at intersections. So the structures that support streetlights also need to be factored into the discussion and recommendation. So 65 feet is just a representative point in that height range. There's structures that it sounds like the max at the crossings for like streetlight locations could be up to 85 feet, where it has to go over traffic signals, for example. So the streetlights are a piece of that design component, but all of those poles are designed in conjunction with the City of Tucson design for the streetlight, traffic lights, other infrastructure for the project. So I don't want you to misconstrue though that height is the absolute single height for every single structure.
And Mr. Chair, members of the board, I just in case you weren't so familiar with that corridor, about 300 feet east.
I'm trying to find, I guess, the company that owns my lien right now. I paid off my car in January of 2020.
Oops, somebody needs to put themselves on mute. Go ahead, Ian.
So about 300 feet east of the current roadway, runs a Western Area Power Administration major power line that's roughly, I think, guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but 80 to 100 feet metal cage structure. So I just wanted, if you guys aren't familiar with it, there is a large structural transmission line that is already on the east side of that corridor in the view line running parallel to the roadway. This actually, TEP's poles would actually be closer to that alignment than they currently are on the west side of the roadway. So I just wanted to provide that as context for this landscape and that scenic view shed.
Thank you, Ian, for that context.
That brings up another point. If the conversation, the larger conversation has co-lining with that easement been explored?
Good point, Steve.
Yeah, and
Chris.
that's not an option given the right of way and that the alignment along Silverbell contains distribution that feeds homes and commercial businesses. So the right of way for, say, the WAPA or those higher voltage transmission lines, those are like, you could think of those like a highway with semis carrying electrons, whereas the Silverbell alignment is more like a smaller arterial street, and then the distribution is more like a neighborhood street. So we can't run, the distribution system through that right away and then connect all of the residential and commercial customers along Silverbell.
Sure. So in that analogy, that highway you just described is not allowed to have a frontage road?
The current frontage road, I guess, in that analogy would be Silverbell.
And also to add, it passes through Columbus Park, which would pose a loss of recreational area if you did that.
Okay, so now you're into 4F.
Correct.
Oh yeah. What if you? I stated this earlier, but if you haven't noticed, every one of my questions is necessarily targeted to: has every option been explored, and provided information upon to this board? And that's something that's a sticky point with me, having had to navigate variances in the past, and that I feel like we're asking questions and getting anecdotal answers and nothing. I feel like that part of a presentation to this board would have detailed these options that potentially could have been brought up, and saying that they are not a viable option, because part of the variance process is that that the option being provided to us is the least amount of relief or least impact relief needed to get the entity installed, and that all other options and opportunities are not available through external forces, i.e. not a self-imposed condition. So I keep asking these questions in that vein of that. I feel like we're being told this is the only option, but not really being expressed to us why this is the only option available to this project, when there were other areas, and we're getting that information, but it seems like, we've had to do this for 2.5 hours plus a meeting prior, to get to this information. It seems as though
Well, I think.
I guess, Nate, my point is I'm almost leaning towards, I kind of want our vote to be almost an abstain.
Yeah.
Like, we can I don't know if I want to say I approve or disapprove of this variance, because I feel like I don't have all the information that would require me or be required of me to get a variance if I was going for a variance for another project, and that we can give recommendations to the Board of Adjustments either way. Our vote doesn't necessarily have to be black and white as we approve or disapprove of this variance request. We can remain silent on the variance request with recommendations if I believe that I know it's not written into that motion, the standard language motion that we have, but I don't feel I have the information to give 100% of an answer, yes or no, on this.
Well,
but I do have things I'd like the Board of Adjustments to look at if they are going to make a recommendation, which they are going to do next Wednesday or whatever that meeting is.
And I tend to agree with Chris that I don't think we should try and be figuring out if it's better to say we approve it or not. You know, ideally we'd have, you know, I do feel that there are some issues that haven't been addressed. And part of that relates to the city, you know, when their lighting plan or whatever. But I think the point is to get our points of where more work can be communicated to this review board. And I don't think deciding on that vote one way or the other necessarily, if I was going to decide, I would, I mean, I understand it doesn't want to be underground, but I'm just worried about giving the approval of the variance will be seen as something bigger than our comments and concerns.
Yeah, and I think just to address those points briefly, any of those considerations and all of the different alternatives being contemplated all boil down to one primary thing, and that is that any one of those alternatives, if it were to be executed, would have significant impacts on extremely valuable cultural and archaeological resources. And so the approval is not necessarily approving an overhead transmission line or sub-transmission line so much as it is prioritizing the heritage resources and ancestral resources in this area in light of all of the factors, and that the scenic values, given that there is already an existing transmission line or sub-transmission line there right now, all that taken into consideration with the archaeological resources, that it's the best design in an effort to avoid impacts per the project design as Ian laid out. So I think any one of those scenarios, you know, boils down to those resources, and that's the intent, is to avoid impacts.
Okay.
But if I could just suggest, okay, you can't. We have a 3 to 4 foot fill on the road. I'm assuming there's that same 3 to 4 foot fill for the MUP path. So why can't we put it in there? I still don't quite understand that.
We're not going to be able to design a solution as a design review board when we meet, you know, for 2 hours. This team has been working on it for 2 years or something like that.
Okay.
So, but what I think we need to do is help the Board of Adjustment out a little bit, because I don't know who's on the Board of Adjustments, but they're going to have about 2 hours to think about this too. And if the recommendation from the board is, we don't know, we don't have enough information, that's not any help to them. I wish there was a design review board that would give us a recommendation so we could base our recommendation on their recommendation. But we're that design review board. So I think, you know, we're only making a reason. We have some data in front of us that suggests it is reasonable that they need to go above ground. And that's primarily what Ian presented in the cultural thing. Any more excavation that is absolutely required is conflicting with the underground resources, and we're not going to get around that. And so that's the reason why they're going above ground, whether they're at 65 or 85 or 55. You know, we could say that they should have to prove that each of their pole heights is the absolute minimum required to get the job done, right? But I feel that the Board of Adjustments is going to approve this, and they need to hear from us what our concerns are. If you guys want to deny it because you don't have enough information, you know, we've exhausted our time period that was allotted to us as a advisory board.
Right, Nate, I think we're on the same page there as far as from my point of view that I think we've established that minimum criterion, right? That the main focus of this variance is to find relief from the requirement that undergrounding the electric lines is required per the scenic corridor code. The relief they are going after is that they would be allowed to utilize the existing or maintain the existing condition of above ground utility poles. That's a baseline, correct?
Yes.
The questions we are having, and the question I have currently, is how to express to the Board of Adjustments that I feel like the relief from that provision of that the underground installation of the utility, that what is being proposed is the minimum required to gain that relief. And I'm not sure that's been expressed, and that the location of the poles and the height of the poles and the aesthetic quality of this scenic corridor is coming down to what I feel is kind of a potentially a financial burden that I don't feel I've been given enough information as to why the west side, other than prior project pushing the lines to the east side, what the pros and cons of that corridor location would be versus the east side locations. So there's some of these ideas of the design and the decisions made of locations and heights of the installation of the above ground poles. I think we make recommendations about our concerns of that process, but I think we've come to a consensus that the variance request in front of us, they've met the requirements to show that there's an undue burden on this project that was not self-imposed, and that they've shown that there is a relief available. How they implement that relief is the thing I think we're having heartburn on. So if we can move past yes or no on the variance and move to what our recommendations or our additional comments to the motion, that's where I'd like to go, and I think we can do that pretty quickly because it's heights, locations, and the implementation of the poles and screening within a scenic corridor. For I think for Carol's point of view, it's screening of the vehicles or pedestrians or other mobility within the corridor, and what is the screening or impact of this visually for areas outside of the corridor looking into the corridor, which is also within the purview of a scenic corridor road.
Chris, throw out some language then that we can.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to kind of. I tend, if you guys haven't noticed on these meetings, I tend to speak for a minute, and as I'm doing that kind of, I got to think out loud a little bit sometimes and help that maybe bullet point my thoughts. And I'd like to bullet point these thoughts that I think we have, as a board, design review board, we have concerns about the implementation of the locations of the power of the utility poles, overall heights of the utility poles in relation to City of Tucson required street lighting program. And we have concerns about mitigation of visual impacts and quality to the corridor itself and the surrounding community.
Yeah, those are concerns. How about a condition? Applicant must demonstrate each new pole height is the absolute minimum allowed for public safety. They must demonstrate that. That's a condition, subject to the following condition.
But I think they can show that if we keep our existing city street plan, it sounds like. So that's why the city needs to look at what they're doing too.
And So then we add on top of that, applicant must demonstrate that the city's street lights are the absolute minimum required for public safety.
And, you know, I mean, yeah, who's even walking along here? I mean, I'm just saying that there are safety studies and, you know, related to that bike path or whatever. But also meeting the sky ordinance of the city's requirements too.
Well, that they will meet the sky ordinance. They're not getting an exception on that. I'm writing because I'm trying to get to something here.
Yeah. And I'm going to have to go shortly, so I won't be able to do the other items.
We're going to lose our quorum in about 10 minutes then. So
Mr. Kapler, Ms. Clement, Mr. Stevie, are you able to stay after you do this meeting? We need at least 3 members present at all times.
I have an absolute cutoff of 10:45 today. So the other items on our agenda, we should probably reschedule. Now, here's what I wrote down. Subject to the following conditions. As the pole height is related to the street light poles, applicant must demonstrate that the street lights are absolutely the minimum required for public safety and demonstrate the new pole heights for power poles should be the minimal allowed for public safety.
That sounds good.
Okay, I'm going to make a motion. The motion is the Design Review Board has reviewed the proposed scenic corridor zone modifications, reductions, and deletions and recommends to the Board of Adjustment approval, finding the project in compliance with the criteria established in UDC sections 310.3.k. See attachment A, subject to the following conditions. As the height of the new power poles is related to the height and number of city street lights, the applicant must demonstrate that the number and placement of street lights are the absolute minimum required for public safety. And the applicant must demonstrate that the new power pole heights are the absolute minimum allowed for public safety.
And maybe just add, and where possible, coordinate and offset these to minimize both.
This, let's see. This condition would require the efficient coordination. No, I think that's getting,
Yeah.
if it's the absolute minimum street lights, and it's the absolute minimum, because what we want is to minimize the number and the height. They need to demonstrate that.
But also the location, you know, because if they can be on one side and on the opposite side, then obviously there's that relationship, right?
That's how they minimize it. Yes, that's how they minimize it.
Well, we don't know that's how they do. That's what I'm saying.
Can you read back the motion?
Nate, could you just add in that you said that the least height, I'd like to add in that the applicant demonstrate that physical locations of City of Tucson street lighting and street lighting and poles has been coordinated to reduce all as much conflict with the proposed utility. Is that where you're going, Susanna? Is that those locations, the physical location of the City of Tucson street lighting, may have opportunity to be relocated to minimize potential conflicts with the power?
Yeah.
You guys, I am liking Chris's idea of abstaining for, and we write these same concerns as to why we abstain. I am not feeling comfortable about approval on this one.
Well, yeah, but I would say that we are leaning towards an above ground situation. I think we're all clear that we don't want to destroy these cultural sites. So I think if we don't give the approval, we should make that part of our statement to help the review board.
Maria, can you read back the motion, or shall I try to do it again?
Please try to do it again, Mr. Kapler.
Okay. The Design Review Board has reviewed the proposed scenic corridor zone modifications, reductions, and deletions, and recommends to the Board of Adjustment approval, finding the project in compliance with the criteria established in UDC Section 310.3K. See Attachment A, subject to the following conditions. As the power pole height is related to the adjacent street light height, the applicant must demonstrate that the City of Tucson street lights are the absolute minimum required for the public safety, and the applicant must demonstrate that the new power pole heights should be the absolute minimum allowed for public safety.
One thing to note to Mr. Stevie's comment about locations, the U.S. Army TEP is constrained by the U.S. Army Corps' designation of the area of potential effects in where they can relocate. So they must relocate within that cage. They cannot step foot out of that cage. Coming back to the WAPA example, I forgot to provide that information. I apologize. So they are constricted by that APE.
Let's just task the applicant with demonstrating that the poles, both the lights and the power poles, are the absolute minimum. That's our goal. That's the only kind of relief. So
correct.
If they can reduce those pole heights, they need to. So there's a motion. It would need to be seconded, or someone else could make another motion that would need to be seconded.
Nate, I'd like to propose an amendment to that motion.
Go ahead.
I'd like to add another one of our conditions, and Carol, this is for you, that landscape improvements within the corridor are, let me see here, let me think this in my head. I'm going to try not to think out loud first. That landscape improvements within the corridor are to the best of the ability to provide relief, visual relief of the bases of the power poles, locations for users of the corridor themselves, of the corridor itself. Scenic corridor itself. Thank you.
Yeah, that works, Chris.
Does that help, Carol? We're not going to help it. We're not going to get anything for long ways away with tree locations. It would be relief from the vertical. I know.
Yeah. All right. Say it one more time so that Maria can capture it.
Okay. I'd like to add to amendment to the proposed motion stating that landscaping, i.e. trees, within the scenic corridor be strategically positioned to provide visual relief from the pole locations.
For all users.
For all users of the scenic corridor.
Yeah.
All right, the motion is now amended. Is there a second?
So there was question about whether we're going to abstain from the variance. Are we going for the approval now then?
The motion, yeah, the motion right now is approval with conditions. The other one is a no decision. I don't like the no decision because our job is to make a recommendation. So I feel like I can, if someone were to challenge me, later on when I'm at a party and someone says, Nate, I see that you guys approved these power poles. What are you thinking? I'm going to just give the presentation that Ian gave them and say, what would you guys do? The evidence is that you have to do it. So I feel comfortable with the information that was presented today.
I'll second that, Nate.
Chris has seconded the motion as amended. There's no point in any more discussion. I'm going to call for a vote.
Could I ask Maria a question? Maria, can I abstain or oppose with a reason why that goes in the records?
Ms. Clement, Mr. Kepler, members of the DRB, that is correct.
Thank you.
It's like the Supreme Court. You can write the dissenting opinion.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to call for first all those that approve, a yes vote, a no vote, and any abstainers. I'll call those all out separately.
So,
all
Mr. Kepler, just want to mention that Ms. Pride left the meeting at 9:55 a.m. So we do have now 4 DRB members present, and that constitutes a quorum.
Good to note. So all in favor, say aye or raise your hand. Aye.
Aye.
All right. Any opposed, say nay. Or raise your hand. All right. No opposed, and abstain. I don't know what you say for abstain, but raise your hand. Okay, Carol and Susanna.
And can I say a reason why?
Yes.
At this time, I do not feel that all possible options have been looked at, and I do not feel comfortable approving.
Thank you. So the motion, I don't know if it passed or not. Is that like a 2 to, what is it? 2 yes, 0 no's, and 2 abstains? I don't know.
I think
I don't know if it passed.
Mr. Chairman, it's 2-2, and motion fails for lack of a majority vote.
But does it fail? No one's voted against it.
But does that mean we still will have this document go to your meeting next week?
With the conditions, that's our point, Nate. We need them to see why we're in such a quandary about this.
They don't take failed motions on.
Well, that's why I'm asking, because I may change my vote if they don't.
So here's a question. If people don't vote, that counts as a no?
Yeah.
No, it counts as a not positive.
It doesn't count as a no, but in order for a motion to move forward, it has to have a majority vote. So it would have to be like a 3-1 since you don't have 5 people here.
So
Thank you for clarification.
Will you guys not look at you won't look at anything if there isn't anything passed then?
Correct.
No, I want to assure you all, if you all fail to reach a consensus, then I will present to the Board of Adjustment that you failed to reach a consensus, that it was a split vote of 2 recommending approval with conditions and 2 abstaining. And I will read into the record the reasons why.
For our abstentions, correct, Ms. Wells?
That is correct.
Thank you, ma'am.
Conditions of the.
But
I did not hear
the conditions of the. Would you read the motion? The conditions of the motion would not be public record then. Just that we couldn't come to a consensus.
I think our strategy might be to pass it and have 1 abstain and put the reasons for abstaining
Well, that's
And
why I'm
then,
trying to get her to say if those conditions will be listed to the group, if it is a stance.
Mr. Chair, members of the board, in the interest of time and the amount of energy that you've all put into this, I would like to state that what I can do is I will submit and read into the record that the DRB considered this at 2 different hearings, and at the conclusion of the second hearing, motion was made to approve. The vote was 2 in support of the motion with conditions and 2 abstained. I will read what the conditions were, and I will also read why there were abstentions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Then it can stay as stands. I just want to make sure
And-
those conditions are read.
Sure, and Ms. Dix, I didn't have a reason from you. I had one from Ms. Clemens.
I guess it would be similar that just that those conditions, just needing those to be seen in advance, that all those things were actually resolved and presented to us.
okay, thank you, everybody.
With the
I can. You need anything else on this one, Rosalind or Maria?
no, Maria, do you feel you comfortably captured everything?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you all. I really want to thank you all. You know, I've been involved with the DRB. I first staffed DRB like probably 15 years ago, and I did it for almost a decade. And I have to say, this group is one of the most thorough groups I've seen. You take your job seriously, and the city of Tucson applauds you and thanks you for your conscientiousness in trying to work through and come to a decision based on facts. So thank you very, very much for your time, your energy, your effort.
Well said. Thank you very much.
And how can we hear what happens in your meeting next week?
You're welcome to attend.
Is that? Tell me. I would love to be. I've never been to this kind of meeting. I'd love to go. When is it?
It's next Wednesday at the meeting is at 1:30. A study session will be held prior to that, but the meeting commences at 1:30. And if you go to the city's the city's webpage, either our Planning and Development Services webpage, and click on Public Meetings, you can access the link there, or you can go to the city clerk's office and access the link through their webpage.
Thank you so much.
Unfortunately, I have to drop off now. And so what I think that would mean is we would lose our quorum. And there are 2 other applications. I think we should reschedule those, Maria.
Wrestling, how does that work? I haven't had this situation before.
I think she left.
Sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute myself. Since you no longer have a quorum, you can't take action on the following items. So they would automatically have to get rescheduled to your next meeting unless you call a special meeting.
I'm willing to call, I'm willing to do it next Friday again.
Yeah, the next scheduled meeting with the DRB is until 2 weeks from now, November 5th.
I'm willing to do that too.
Mr. Steve?
Nate and Maria, this is Chris. I'm willing to be available at the applicant's, the word I'd want to say is preference, but since we are providing, or we are the ones providing that this meeting is not being held per the agenda, I feel it might be my duty personally that I'd be available on their schedule to have a special meeting, not necessarily on the Friday timeline, if that's an option with the rest of the board. I'd like to give them every opportunity to not reduce their timeline and or not provide undue burden on their schedules, since we are the ones cutting this meeting short.